You wake in the darkness while the rest of the town still belongs to sleep. A slow lifting from a dreamless rest into the cool silence of a cottage that has known your presence for many years. The wool blanket is heavy and warm against your shoulders, and you remain still for a long moment, letting the last traces of night settle around you before you even think of moving. The air inside the room is calm and faintly tinged with the scent of old wood ash from the hearth, a smell that you have come to associate with the earliest part of the morning when the world outside has not yet drawn breath. You shift your weight on the straw mattress gradually, feeling the familiar dip in the center, where your body has shaped the bedding over countless nights, and you listen to the absolute quiet beyond the walls, a quiet so complete it seems to have a texture, like a thick felt, laid over the entire market town. Your feet find the cold planks of the floor, and you stand without hurry, pulling a woolen tunic over your nightshirt and stepping across the room with the slow, certain steps of someone who could walk this space blindfolded. The hearth at the far end of the single room is nothing more than a mound of grey ash with a few buried embers still breathing faint threads of orange. So you crouch down, rake the ash aside with a small iron hook, and uncover the glowing heart that has survived the night. You place a handful of dry straw on the embers, followed by 3 slender sticks of kindling arranged in a loose triangle, and then a small split log of seasoned beech that you take from a basket beside the hearth. The fire wakes in stages. A whisper of yellow flame that rises, sinks back, then rises again with more confidence, and soon a gentle warmth begins to push back the chill that had gathered in the corners. You straighten up, your knees giving a small, familiar creak, and turn toward the window that faces the market square. The shutters are closed, 2 broad wooden panels fitted snugly into the stone frame. You lift the iron latch, which is cool and slightly rough under your thumb, and swing the shutters inward without a sound, because you have oiled the hinges with a drop of goose fat only last week, and they move as smoothly as water over a weir. The sky outside is in the act of changing, a deep slate grey near the horizon, where the last stars are still faintly visible, softening upward into a band of pale gold that grows broader with every passing moment. Below the sky, the cobbled market square lies empty and silent, the stones still dark with the night's dew, catching the first uncertain light in a way that makes them shimmer like the back of a wet otter. The timber-framed buildings that ring the square, with their overhanging upper stories and diamond-paned windows, are all shuttered and still, their plasterwork a muted cream against the dark oak beams. Nothing moves, not a cat, not a pigeon, not a wisp of smoke from any chimney but your own. The town is a painted backdrop waiting for a day that has not yet arrived. You stand at the open window and breathe the air, which is cool and clean and carries the faintest trace of wood smoke, damp stone, and the green scent of the countryside that begins just beyond the last row of houses. The breath you take is deep and unhurried, and as you let it out, you can see the ghost of it hanging before you for a single heartbeat before vanishing. You are not in a hurry. The Assize Court opening is 3 days away. The proclamation will be made this afternoon, and the morning stretches out before you, with no demands other than the quiet tasks you have set for yourself. You leave the window open, so that the room can fill with the gentle freshness of the breaking day, and you move to the hearth to prepare your morning drink. A small iron kettle hangs from a hook over the fire, already half full of water from the evening before. You swing it over the growing flames and watch the metal darken as the heat takes hold. While you wait for the water to warm, you take a small linen pouch from a shelf near the hearth and shake a modest pinch of dried sage leaves into the palm of your hand. The leaves are grey-green and brittle, and as you crush them lightly between your fingers, a sharp, clean, herbaceous scent rises up, clearing the last of the sleep from your head. You drop the crushed sage into an earthenware cup, a simple thing with a brown glaze that has crackled into a fine web over the years, and when the water in the kettle begins to shiver and release the first wisps of steam, you pour it carefully over the leaves. The water darkens at once to a pale amber, and you carry the cup to the table by the window, cradling it in both hands for the warmth. You break a piece of bread from a round loaf that has been sitting on the board since yesterday, its crust now firm and chewy, and you eat it slowly, dipping a corner into the sage tea to soften it. The taste is simple, earthy, and satisfying in the way that only the plainest food can be when a long day of patient work lies ahead. While you finish the last of the bread and rinse your hands in a small basin of cold water, the light outside continues to strengthen. The sky has moved from grey and gold to a soft, even blue, and the sun, still hidden behind the rooftops, is making the edges of the chimneys glow. You know from long experience that the best light for the task you have planned will fall across the table by the window for the next several hours, a steady, indirect brightness that will let you see every detail of the metal you mean to polish without the glare of direct sun. You set about gathering the things you will need, moving through the cottage with the methodical calm that comes from having performed this ritual many times. First, you take a shallow wooden bowl from a low shelf, a bowl made of turned ash wood that has been worn smooth by years of use, its rim darkened by the oils of many hands. You set it on the table, then open a cupboard near the hearth and retrieve a second small dish, this one of red earthenware, containing a fine white powder made of chalk that you ground yourself last spring from a lump of the soft white stone found in the chalk pits half a day's walk to the south. You place this beside the wooden bowl, then find a small clay jar no bigger than a hen's egg, stoppered with a cork and filled with cold-pressed linseed oil. A second clay jar, taller and narrower, holds white vinegar made from the sour apples that grow in the orchard behind the Guildhall, and you set it next to the oil with the same careful economy of motion. From a drawer in the table itself you take out a collection of soft cloths, squares of old linen that have been washed so many times they have lost all their stiffness and become as pliable as a handkerchief, along with one strip of leather-backed cowhide that you use for buffing and a length of clean, dry flannel for the final polish. Each piece of cloth is folded neatly and arranged in a row according to size, from the smallest rag, no bigger than your palm, to the largest, which could wrap a newborn lamb. At last you go to the wooden chest that stands at the foot of your bed, a simple coffer of oak with iron hinges and a lock that has not been turned in years. You lift the lid, and inside, nested in a bed of grey wool felt, is the brass bell of the town crier. The box itself is lined with the same felt, cut and stitched to cradle the bell so that it cannot shift or knock against the sides. You take hold of the box by its two leather handles and carry it with both hands to the table, setting it down at the far end, where it will wait until everything else is ready. The bell inside is invisible, but you can feel its weight through the box, a solid, reassuring presence, and you let it rest there while you complete your preparations. You pour a small amount of water from the kettle into a clean clay dipper and place it beside the bowl, then unstop the vinegar, the oil, and the jar of chalk powder so that nothing must be fumbled for later. The window is now fully bright with the cool, shadowless light of early morning, and a breeze moves through it, stirring the scent of sage and cold ash and the faint, dusty smell of the old timber walls. You take the wooden stool that has stood in the same spot by the hearth for as long as you can remember, its seat polished to a dark sheen by the constant passage of your woolen breeches, and you carry it to the table, placing it squarely before the collection of objects that await you. You sit down, feel the stool take your weight with a small, satisfied creak, and you rest your hands, palms down, on your knees. The rough wool of your tunic is warm under your fingers, and you take a long, quiet breath, the kind of breath that fills the bottom of your lungs and empties your mind of everything except the work that is about to begin. The town beyond the window is still silent, still empty, still holding its breath. Nothing is required of you except to polish a brass bell, slowly and well, in the first light of a day that has no other plans. And so you sit, perfectly still, perfectly calm, ready to lift the bell from its felt bed and begin. You sit for a while longer with your hands resting on your knees, letting the stillness of the morning settle around you like a second blanket, the fire murmuring softly to itself in the hearth, and the open window admitting a slow, steady current of cool air that carries the scent of damp stone and the faint greenness of the countryside beyond the town walls. The table in front of you holds everything you need, arranged in a neat row as if awaiting inspection, and at the far end of the table, sitting on its own small island of space, is the wooden box lined with grey felt that contains the brass bell. The box is a simple rectangle of dark oak, its corners joined with dovetail joints that have held fast for longer than most men in the town have been alive, its lid fitted with two small iron hinges and a brass clasp shaped like a curled leaf. The wood has been darkened by age and the touch of many fingers, At along one side a long scratch marks the time many years ago, when you caught the box against the iron latch of the Guildhall door and spent an afternoon rubbing the scratch with walnut meat to make it less visible. The scratch is still there, a thin, pale line like a strand of grey hair, but it does not trouble you. It is only a record of a moment that passed and was mended. You reach for the box now, moving your hands slowly across the tabletop as if through water, and you place your palms on either side of the lid, feeling the grain of the oak, which has been smoothed by repeated oiling until it feels almost soft. The clasp opens with a small definite click when you press the leaf-shaped catch with your thumb, and you lift the lid back on its hinges, letting it rest against the edge of the table so that it can go no further. Inside, the felt lining is a deep charcoal grey, the colour of a cloudy winter sky just before dusk, and it has been shaped into two hollows that hold the bell and its leather strap as securely as a mould. The bell itself lies on its side, the flared mouth facing you, the crown with its small loop for the strap tucked into the deeper part of the hollow, and the iron clapper resting silently inside the dome, held in place by its leather thong. For a long moment you do nothing except look at it, allowing your eyes to travel across every visible surface, noting the way the light from the window falls across the brass and reveals its current state. The brass has a dull, tarnished appearance this morning, a soft brownish gold that seems to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and you can see a thin film of cloudiness that has gathered over the metal during the weeks since the last polishing. It is not dirt exactly, but a kind of bloom, the way a plum left too long in a bowl will show a greyish haze over its purple skin. The bell has been used, carried through the streets in all weathers, rung in the morning damp and the afternoon heat and the evening chill, and the combination of moisture, dust, and the oils from your own hands has left a patina that you know must be lifted away before the Assize Court Proclamation. You tilt your head slightly to one side, studying the bell's condition as a clerk might study a ledger, checking off observations in your mind. The outer surface is uniformly dull. The engraved band of the town crest is clogged with tiny flecks of dried polish from the last cleaning. The rim has a small rough patch where grit from the cobbles must have stuck to the metal after a rainy morning, and the inner curve is dark with the fine grey residue left by the repeated striking of the iron clapper. The bell is not in poor condition. It is merely a bell that has done its work faithfully and now needs to be renewed. The same way a ploughshare needs sharpening after a long season in the field. You reach into the box with both hands, moving with the same deliberate care you would use to lift a sleeping child from a cradle, and you take hold of the bell by its waist, where the engraving makes a slight ridge under your fingers. The brass is cool against your skin, cooler than the air in the room, and it has a smooth, solid weight that you know exactly. A weight you have lifted hundreds of times and could describe in the dark. You cup the bell in your left hand and slide your right hand underneath the closed mouth to support it, then lift it straight up out of the felt hollow, holding it level so that the clapper does not swing and strike the side. The bell clears the box without a sound, and you carry it the short distance across the table, setting it down in the center of a folded linen cloth that you have spread to catch any drips or dust. You lay the bell on its side, exactly as it lay in the box, with the mouth facing toward the window so that the best light can reach inside, and you straighten the cloth around it, tucking a fold under the bell's upper curve to keep it from rolling. Now the bell is free of its box, alone on the broad wooden table with the morning light spilling over it, and you take a moment to simply observe it again from this new angle, without the felt lining to cradle it. The bell is not a large one, perhaps the span of a man's hand from the crown to the lip, and its shape is a classic bell shape, a dome that flares outward into a wide, rounded mouth with a thickened rim where the metal has been rolled back over a wire to give it strength. The brass is an alloy of copper and tin, poured into a mould by a bell founder in some other town long before you were born, and you know from the records in the Guildhall that this bell was cast in the year 1592, the date that is cut into the engraving around its waist. The metal has a warm, honeyed tone under the tarnish, visible in small patches where handling has rubbed the surface clean, and these patches catch the light and glow faintly, promising the full shine that will come with polishing. The handle at the top is a simple loop of brass forged separately and soldered onto the crown, and through this loop a thick leather strap has been threaded. dark with age and slightly shiny in the places where it rubs against the bell. The leather is strong and supple, but you can see that the edges are beginning to fray, tiny fibers lifting away from the main body of the strap, and you make a mental note to inspect it more carefully later, perhaps to replace it before the next court sitting. The iron clapper hangs inside the bell, suspended from the crown by a thinner leather thong, and it rests against the inner curve with a stillness that makes it seem almost part of the metal itself. You lean forward slightly on the stool, bringing your face closer to the bell so that you can examine the surface more carefully. The tarnish has a pattern, if you can call it a pattern. It is darker in the areas where your fingers most often touch the bell, a faint smear of brownish discoloration that follows the curve of the waist on one side, and lighter on the opposite side, where the bell has been protected by the angle of your grip. Up near the crown, the metal has an almost smoky quality, as if a fine soot had settled there, and you know this comes from the slow accumulation of dust that has been baked onto the brass by the heat of the sun during long processions. The engraved band that runs around the middle is the most intricate part of the bell, a ribbon of closely spaced lines and curves that form the town's crest and the founding date, and this band shows the most accumulation of old polish. The previous times you buffed the bell, tiny particles of the paste dried inside the grooves and hardened, and now the engraving looks clogged and dull. The detail softened into a blur. You trace a fingertip along the band, feeling the shallow cuts of the metal, and you can tell by touch where the original sharpness has been lost under layers of residue. The rim of the bell, where the metal flares and rolls outward, has a different texture altogether. It feels slightly rough, almost sandy, and when you look at it from the side against the light, you can see a fine grey line of what must be road grit, the tiny particles of stone and dried mud that the bell picked up from the ground when you once had to set it down on the cobbles during a sudden downpour. This line is thin but persistent, and you know it will need extra attention during the polishing. You pick up the bell again, lifting it carefully with both hands, and bring it closer to your face, close enough that you can smell it. The scent of the brass is subtle but unmistakable, a faint metallic tang that reminds you of the taste of a copper penny held under the tongue, mingled with the warmer, earthier smell of old leather from the clapper strap, and the handling oils that have soaked into the metal over decades. There is also a hint of something acidic, a sharpness that might be the residue of the vinegar you used in the last polish, still clinging to the microscopic pores of the brass long after the visible paste was wiped away. You rotate the bell slowly, inhaling its quiet story, and you notice that the interior, which is harder to see, has a different scent, more metallic, more raw, with a slight burnt note from the iron clapper striking the inside curve. You set the bell down on its side again and lean even closer, peering into the dark cavity of the mouth. The inside curve is a concave wall that narrows toward the crown, and in the dim light you can make out a fine coating of greyish dust that has settled there over the months, a powder so fine it looks almost like smoke frozen in place. Where the clapper rests against the metal, there is a small circular area of brighter brass, worn clean by the repeated impact, and around it a faint halo of darker discoloration that you know is the result of tiny iron particles embedding themselves into the brass. This is the part of the bell that does the most work, the part that must be perfectly smooth and clean if the ring is to be clear and true. You sit back on the stool and let your hands fall to your lap, giving yourself a moment to simply absorb what you have seen and felt. The inspection has been thorough, and you have found nothing unexpected, only the familiar evidence of a well-used tool that is ready to be made new again. The rough patch on the rim will yield to paste and patience. The clogged engraving will open under the point of a softened twig and a careful rub. The grey dust inside will lift away with a damp cloth. The cloudiness on the outer surface will dissolve into a deep, warm shine. You know all of this because you have done it many times before, each time with the same careful steps, the same quiet attention. The polishing of the bell is a ritual that has no surprises, only the slow unfolding of a process that moves from dullness to brightness as predictably as the morning moves toward noon. You reach out and touch the bell again, not for inspection this time, but simply to feel its presence under your palm, the weight of its history and its purpose. This bell has rung for market days and holy days, for the announcement of new laws and the reading of old ones, for the proclamation of the Assize Courts that bring the king's justice to the townspeople. It has been heard by farmers coming in from the fields, and by merchants arranging their wares, by children pausing in their games, and by old women drawing water from the well. Its voice is woven into the fabric of the town as surely as the cobbles in the square and the beams in the Guildhall roof. And tomorrow it will speak again, calling the people to hear the words that open the court. You, as the town crier, are the keeper of that voice, the one who ensures that the bell will ring clear and true, and that responsibility is not a heavy one, but a quiet honor that you carry as easily as you carry the bell itself. The room has grown brighter while you have been sitting here, the sun now climbing above the rooftops and sending a shaft of stronger light through the window, a light that is no longer soft and grey, but a clear, pale yellow that makes the dust motes dance in the air. The fire has settled into a steady bed of embers, its flames no longer visible, and the sage tea in the cup has gone cold and dark. Everything is as it should be. You take up the small clay jar of chalk powder and pour a modest mound into the shallow wooden bowl, watching the fine white particles tumble and pile with a soft hush. You add the vinegar drop by drop, counting to 3, and you hear the faint fizz as the acid meets the chalk, a sound so small it is little more than a whisper. You stir the mixture with the end of the strict hazel twig, small circles at first, then larger ones as the paste begins to come together, and the scent of vinegar and chalk rises to mix with the fresh air from the window. The paste is still too thick, so you add a dribble of cold water from the dipper and stir again, watching the consistency change from a stiff dough to a smooth cream. Finally, you add the single drop of linseed oil, which spreads out over the surface of the paste in a thin, iridescent film before you stir it in, and the mixture becomes glossy and rich, the color of old ivory with a faint grey grit. You test it between your thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight abrasiveness that will lift the tarnish without scratching the brass, and you nod once to yourself, satisfied. The paste is ready. The bell is ready. The quiet morning stretches out ahead, and there is nothing else to do but begin. The paste you've made sits in the shallow wooden bowl, a mound of creamy white that catches the morning light and holds it in a soft, pearly sheen, and you look at it for a while with the same unhurried attention you gave to the bell when it first came out of its felt bed. The surface of the paste is perfectly smooth now, with no dry pockets of chalk and no streaks of oil, because you stirred it thoroughly with the bare twig of hazel, moving your wrist in steady, patient circles that blended the ingredients into a single substance that is neither liquid nor solid, but something in between, a suspension of fine particles held together by moisture and the faint binding power of the oil. The vinegar has done its work, releasing tiny bubbles of gas from the chalk that have now mostly subsided, leaving behind only a pale froth at the edges of the bowl, a froth so thin it looks like sea foam cast up on a miniature shore. The scent of the mixture is clean and sharp, but not unpleasant, the way crushed mint leaves smell when you rub them between your palms, and underneath that sharpness there is a soft, nutty note from the linseed oil that warms the whole preparation and keeps it from being too harsh. You lean closer and draw the scent in slowly, letting it fill your nose and settle at the back of your throat, where it lingers with a faint tickle that you do not mind. The paste is not ready for the bell just yet. It needs to rest for a short time so that the ingredients can fully combine and the chalk can absorb the moisture evenly, the same way a dough must rest before it is shaped into loaves. You know this from long practice, and you are content to wait, so you place the damp cloth loosely over the bowl to keep the paste from drying, and you turn your attention to the cloths you will use for the application. The cloths lie in their neat row at the edge of the table, each one folded into a square or a strip according to its purpose, and you take a moment to sort through them again, touching each one with the tips of your fingers to make sure it is clean and free of any grit that might scratch the bell. The largest cloth is a square of old linen, pale cream in color with a few faint brown spots that are not dirt, but the ghosts of old stains bleached out by sun and washing, and you unfold it across your knee to check its surface. The linen is soft and slightly fuzzy from years of use, its threads loosened into a gentle nap that will hold the paste without letting it clump, and you can see the warp and weft crossing each other in a fine grid that is as regular as a honeycomb. This cloth will be your main working rag, the one you dip into the paste and rub over the broad outer surface of the bell, and you fold it into a thick pad that fits comfortably in your palm. Beside it, A second cloth of the same linen but smaller and cut into a strip as wide as 2 fingers lies waiting to be wrapped around your index finger for reaching inside the bell's mouth, and a third, even smaller, has been folded into a tight point for working paste into the engraved band. You have a separate cloth, dampened with clean water from the dipper, that you will use to wipe away the spent paste, and another dry flannel for the final buff of each section. Every cloth has its role, and you arrange them in the order you will need them, just as a scribe lays out quills and ink before beginning a long document. The preparation of the paste in the cloths has filled a span of time that is impossible to measure by any clock, because there is no clock in the cottage and the only measure of the morning is the slow movement of the light across the table. The sunbeam that earlier was a pale yellow shaft has now thickened and warmed, falling in a broad rectangle across the tabletop and catching the edges of the wooden bowl, the clay jars, and the polished rim of the bell with a honey-coloured glow that makes the whole arrangement look like a still life painted by some careful Dutch master. Dust motes drift through the beam in lazy, spiralling currents, rising on the warmth from the hearth and falling in the cooler air near the window, and you watch them for a moment without thinking of anything at all, letting your mind rest in the simple observation of light and movement. Then you lift the cloth from the bowl and look at the paste again. The resting time has done its quiet work. The paste has stiffened slightly, the way a porridge thickens as it cools, and when you press it gently with the tip of the hazel twig, it yields with a smooth, velvety resistance that tells you the chalk particles have swollen with the absorbed moisture and are now suspended in a matrix that will spread evenly and cut the tarnish without scratching the brass. You stir the paste once more, 3 slow turns of the twig, and the movement leaves a faint track in the surface that slowly fills in and disappears, a sign that the consistency is exactly right. You remove the twig and wipe it on the edge of the bowl, then set it aside on a small scrap of cloth where it will be ready if you need to adjust the mixture later. The bowl itself, you pull closer to the bell, positioning it so that you can reach it easily without stretching, and you lay the damp cloth over one corner of the bowl again, leaving the rest of the paste exposed so that you can dip into it without uncovering too much at once. Now you pick up the main linen pad, the one folded into a square the size of your palm, and you hold it in your right hand, which is your working hand, while your left hand rests slightly on the bell to steady it. You dip one corner of the pad into the paste, pressing it down just enough to pick up a small amount, no larger than a broad bean, and you lift the pad away, letting the excess drip back into the bowl in a thin, lazy string that stretches and breaks. The paste on the cloth is a soft dollop of white that glistens with a faint oil sheen, and you look at it for a moment, ensuring it is not too thick and not too thin, before you turn back to the bell. You do not rush the first application. This moment, the moment between preparation and action, has its own quiet weight, and you sit with it as you would sit with the pause before the first note of a hymn. The bell lies on its side before you, its dull brass waiting, and you choose your starting point carefully, beginning at the very top of the outer dome, just below the crown where the metal rises into a smooth, unadorned curve that catches the light along its crest. You bring the paste-coated pad to the brass, touching it with the lightest pressure at first, and you begin to move your hand in a small, slow circle no wider than a coin. The paste transfers from the cloth to the metal in a thin, even layer, a wash of white that immediately takes on a faint greyish tint as it begins to lift the tarnish. The sensation under your hand is a gentle, granular drag, the fine chalk particles doing their work without any sharpness, and the sound that the motion produces is a soft, rhythmic whisper. A sound like dry leaves stirred by a breeze or the far-off rustle of grain being poured from a sack. You continue the small circles, overlapping each one with the last so that no spot is missed, and you cover the entire top dome in a patchwork of white strokes that gradually merge into a single, uniform coat. The work is repetitive and slow, and you let your breathing settle into the same rhythm as your hand, a quiet in and out that matches the circling motion. This part of the bell, the upper dome, is a gentle, unbroken curve with no tricky edges or engraved lines to trap the paste, so you can work in broad, sweeping strokes once the first layer has been smoothed out. You pick up more paste on the cloth, dipping just the corner again and taking the same small amount, and you resume the motion, widening your circles to cover more area with each pass. The paste begins to dry slightly as you work, its white color fading to a translucent gray, and you can see the brass underneath starting to emerge, a stripe of warm gold that glows through the thinning paste, like the sun through morning mist. When the paste on the upper dome has turned fully grey and begun to feel dry and powdery under the cloth, you stop and set the pad aside, picking up instead the dampened cloth you have prepared for wiping away the residue. The damp cloth is cool against your fingers, having been moistened with the cold water from the dipper some time ago and left to soak until its fibers are full, but not dripping. You wring it out once, twisting it into a loose rope and then unfolding it, and you begin to wipe the upper dome with long, gentle strokes that follow the curve of the metal. The spent paste lifts away easily, coming off in a thin grey slurry that stains the cloth but leaves no mark on the bell. And as you wipe, you reveal the brass beneath, a brass that now gleams with a soft, rich gold light that seems to come from inside the metal itself, not merely reflected from the window. You fold the damp cloth to a clean section and wipe again, removing the last faint smears, and then you take the dry flannel and buff the surface in quick, light passes that bring up a deeper shine. The upper dome is now transformed, its tarnish completely gone, its color a warm, buttery gold that catches the light and holds it, and you pause to admire the contrast between the polished crown and the still dull waist and mouth below. The line between old and new is as sharp as the horizon line on a clear day, and it gives you a quiet satisfaction to see it, a satisfaction that does not rise to any strong emotion, but simply settles in your chest like a stone dropping into still water. You dip your cloth into the paste bowl again, and this time you turn the bell slightly on its linen base, rotating it so that a fresh section of the outer surface comes into the light. You are working your way down from the top, following the natural shape of the bell as it flares outward, and you apply the paste in the same small circles, working it into the metal with the same steady pressure, listening to the same gentle hush of cloth on brass. This section is more exposed to handling, and the tarnish here is slightly darker, a faint brownish smear that follows the curve at the waist where your left hand most often grips the bell when you ring it. The paste picks up the tarnish quickly, turning grey almost at once, and you work the area for a little longer than the upper dome, adding a second thin coat of paste and rubbing it in until you feel the cloth begin to glide more smoothly, a sign that the layer of oxidation has been lifted. You wipe the section clean with the damp cloth, then buff it with the flannel, and the two polished sections now meet in a seamless band of gold that encircles the bell like a ribbon. The progress is visible and measurable, and you continue with the same methodical pace, section by section, turning the bell by small increments, applying the paste, rubbing, wiping, buffing, moving through the process as steadily as the sun moves across the sky. The part of the bell near the engraved band is more delicate, because the paste must not be allowed to pack into the grooves, and you work this area with extra care, using smaller circles and a lighter touch so that you coat the raised surface of the brass without pressing the paste down into the cuts. The engraving itself still bears the residue of old polish from previous cleanings, and you can see it as a fine white line that follows the contours of the letters and the crest, a line that your current polishing pad cannot reach. You make a mental note to return to it later with the pointed cloth and the softened twig, but for now you simply work around it, polishing the flat metal above and below the engraved band until it matches the rest of the outer surface. The rim of the bell, where the metal rolls over into a thick lip, takes the paste differently. The rough patch you noticed earlier catches against the cloth, and you can feel a faint grittiness under your fingers as you rub. You work this area with extra paste and a slightly firmer pressure, using small back and forth strokes that follow the curve of the rim, and slowly the roughness diminishes, the grit lifting away into the paste and leaving the metal smooth again. You wipe the rim clean and run a fingertip over the spot, feeling only the cool, even surface of polished brass, and the small repair is done. The outer surface of the bell, from crown to rim, now gleams in the morning light with a uniform golden shine, and you set the polishing pad down for a moment, flexing your fingers to ease the gentle ache that comes from holding the same position for a long while. Your hand is not tired in any painful way, only warm from the friction and slightly stiff in the knuckles, and you stretch it open and closed a few times while you look at the bell. It is remarkable how a thin layer of tarnish, no thicker than a breath, can so completely hide the beauty of the metal beneath. The bell now looks as though it has been dipped in liquid sunlight, every curve and plane reflecting the room around it, the window, the hearth, the the beams overhead, and your own calm face, slightly distorted by the convex shape. You can see yourself in the brass, a quiet older man with steady eyes and hands that know what they are doing, and the reflection is a companionable one, a silent witness to the work. The gold color of the polished brass is not a bright brassy yellow, but a deeper, mellower hue, somewhere between amber and honey, the color that only old brass acquires when it has been cared for over many years and allowed to develop a gentle patina beneath the shine. You pour a fresh splash of water from the dipper into the now empty bowl that held the paste, swirling it around to loosen the dried residue, and you wipe the bowl clean with a spare cloth before mixing a second, smaller batch of paste for the inner surface and the engraved band. This second batch is just the same as the first. A mound of chalk powder, a few drops of vinegar that fizz and settle, a dribble of water, a single drop of linseed oil, all stirred together with the hazel twig until they become a smooth cream. You make less this time, only enough to fill the bowl a finger's depth, because the inside of the bell is a smaller area, and the engraving needs only a pinpoint of paste at a time. The new paste smells the same, that sharp, clean scent with the warm, nutty undertone, and it sits in the bowl waiting while you select the small pointed cloth and wrap it around your index finger, twisting the end into a tight cone that you can use for delicate work. The cloth feels snug around your finger, not so tight as to cut off the feeling, but secure enough that it will not slip, and you dab the very tip into the paste, picking up a speck no bigger than a grain of wheat. The bell waits before you, its mouth open and inviting, the dark interior now clearly visible against the bright outer shine, and you lean forward, steadying the bell with your free hand, ready to clean the hidden curve where the clapper will soon strike its note. You take a moment to let your hand rest, the polishing pad set aside on a dry corner of the cloth, the bell before you gleaming in patches that mark the boundary between the work you have already done and the work that still waits. The outer surface is not yet entirely coated with paste, only the upper dome and a few sections of the flaring waist have felt the cloth, and the rest of the brass remains in its dull, tarnished state. A muted brown gold that looks almost shy in the strong morning light. You are not in any hurry to continue, because the process of applying the paste is not a race against the clock, but a slow, careful inhabitation of each small movement, a way of letting your attention settle into the tips of your fingers as they guide the soft linen over the metal. The paste in the bowl has firmed slightly again while you rested, the surface developing a thin, dry skin that cracks like the glaze on a loaf of bread when you touch it with the corner of the rag, so you stir it once more with a hazel twig, 3 slow turns that restore the creamy smoothness, and then you dip the pad into the bowl, picking up a fresh dollop of the white mixture that sticks to the cloth like thick cream clinging to a spoon. The linen pad you are using has absorbed some of the paste from earlier, the fibers darkening to a pale grey where the chalk and oil have worked their way into the weave, and the cloth now feels heavier and slightly cool against your palm, the way a damp handkerchief feels on a warm day when you take it from the wash basin. You spread the pad flat across your fingers, making sure the paste is evenly distributed, and you bring it to the bell once more, touching it to the unpolished section just below the gleaming upper dome. The contact between cloth and brass is soundless at first, a soft landing, and then you begin the same small circular motion, your wrist turning gently as if you were polishing the back of a silver spoon after a meal. The paste spreads out in a thin white film that immediately takes on a faint pearlescence, the chalk particles aligning themselves in the direction of your stroke and creating a pattern of tiny, invisible scratches that are not scratches at all, but the tracks of a gentle abrasive doing its quiet duty. The sound of the motion, when you listen closely, is a dry silken whisper, like a hand brushing fine sand from a stone, or a painter smoothing gesso onto a wooden panel, and it is so soft that the other sounds in the room, the crackle of the fire, the rustle of the breeze at the window, are louder by comparison, making the polishing seem like a secret you are keeping from the wider world. You work the paste into the metal with the same steady pressure, neither too light nor too heavy, a pressure that you have learned through many repetitions to apply without thinking about it, the same way you know exactly how hard to press a knife when slicing bread so that you cut the crust but not the board. The bell absorbs the paste as if it were thirsty, the dull film of tarnish lifting away into the white emulsion, and the color of the paste on the cloth begins to change even as you rub, shifting from clean white to a dirty gray that streaks through the wet film like smoke, trapped under ice. You watch this change without any sense of urgency, noting how the grayness deepens in the areas where the tarnish was thickest, a visible record of the oxidation that had settled onto the brass over the weeks and months of use. Each circle of your hand overlaps the last by half, so that no portion of the metal is missed, and you let your eyes follow the path of the cloth as it moves across the curve, a hypnotic trail that leads from dullness toward the promise of a full shine. When the paste on this section has turned thoroughly grey and begun to feel less slippery under the cloth, you know it is time to move on, so you shift your grip on the bell, rotating it a few degrees on its linen bed, and you present another patch of unpolished brass to the light. The sequence you follow is methodical and predictable. Dip the pad into the bowl, collect a small amount of paste, touch it to the bell, and begin the circles. The repetition is not boring to you, because the word boring does not belong in this room. It is instead a kind of quiet meditation, a filling of the mind with the simple presence of a task that has no surprises and no demands beyond your attention. You let your breathing align with the rhythm of your hand. A slow inhale as you sweep the cloth to the left, a gentle exhale as you bring it back to the right, and the boundary between your body and the work dissolves, leaving only the sensation of the soft rag and the cool brass and the scent of vinegar and chalk that hangs in the air around the table. The light from the window continues to shift as the morning advances, and the beam that once fell across the whole tabletop has now narrowed and intensified, its edges sharper, its color paler and more silvery as the sun climbs higher above the rooftops. This light picks out every tiny irregularity on the bell's surface, every small pit and scratch that the years have left, and you notice them without judgment, the way you would notice the grain of wood in a floorboard or the veins in an old hand. One particular small pit, no larger than a pinhead, sits just below the engraved band, and when you pass the paste over it, the white mixture fills the tiny depression and leaves a dot that stays white even after the surrounding paste turns grey. You pause at this spot, touching it lightly with the tip of the cloth, working the paste into the pit with a gentle pressure that does not try to erase it, but simply cleans it, and when you later wipe the area with a clean corner of the damp rag, the pit will remain, a small dark point in the gold, a mark of the bell's long history that you have no desire to remove. The entire outer dome, from the crown down to the point where the metal begins its sharper flare toward the mouth, is now covered in a layer of greyish paste. But you have not yet wiped it away. You are still in the application stage, and you decide to leave the paste on the upper sections to sit and do its quiet work while you attend to the lower ones. The resting paste will not harm the brass, and the slight drying that happens will make it easier to wipe off later, lifting away in a fine chalky dust that falls into the cloth rather than smearing. So you move your attention downward, dipping the rag again and pressing it to the wide belt of metal that forms the bell's waist, the part that is held most often by your hand when you walk through the town. This area has a warmer, darker tarnish than the dome. Not a uniform film, but a pattern that follows the shape of your palm and fingers, a ghost of your grip left in the oxidation like the shadow of a handprint on a frosty window. You work the paste into this handprint with a little more care, tracing the edge of the discoloration with the tip of the pad, making sure the cleaning is even across the whole surface, and you notice how the paste takes on a browner shade here, pulling up the oils from your skin that had bonded with the metal over time. As you polish the waist, the engraved band with its sheaf of wheat and crossed keys, and the date 1592 lies just above your working area, like a border between two fields, and you avoid pressing the paste into the grooves for now, keeping your circles small and contained. The engraving will be cleaned separately, with a finer tool and a steadier hand, and the thought of that later task sits at the back of your mind as a quiet anticipation, not a worry, a small mental note that you will unwrap when the moment arrives. For now, the broad, unadorned waist is your whole world, a gentle curve of metal that fills your vision and the soft rag that translates your intention into motion, and you work your way around the bell with the same patient circular strokes, rotating the bell again and again on its linen cloth until the entire waist is coated in pale grey. The rim of the bell, the thick rolled lip that will rest against your chest when you carry the bell without ringing it, is the last part of the outer surface to receive the paste, and you approach it with a small adjustment of your grit, holding the pad at a slight angle so that you can follow the rounded contour. The rim is the part of the bell that most often meets the world, resting on stone steps and wooden benches, and occasionally on the damp cobbles of the square. And its surface, though now polished smooth, shows a faint grain when you look very closely, a fine network of tiny scratches that run parallel to the curve, the memory of all those contacts. You apply the paste in strokes that follow the direction of this grain, moving the pad lengthwise along the rim instead of in circles. A variation in technique that feels natural and right, the way a carpenter planes a board with the grain and not against it. The paste coats the rim in a thin, even line of white that soon turns grey, and when you reach the join where the rim meets the body of the bell, you feather the edge of the paste so that there is no abrupt boundary, a smooth transition that will make the final buffing easier. Now the entire outer surface of the bell, from the small soldered loop at the crown to the rolled lip at the mouth, is covered in a thin drying film of greyish paste that looks almost like a chalky skin. And you take the bell gently by the leather strap, lifting it carefully off the table to inspect it from all angles. The paste has covered the metal so completely that the brass is hidden, and the bell now resembles a plaster cast of itself, a phantom bell made of dust and oil and vinegar, waiting for the moment when you will wipe it clean and reveal the gold beneath. The weighted feel of the bell in your hand is the same as always, but the surface under your fingers is slightly gritty and dry, a texture that reminds you of the way a smooth river stone feels after you have rolled it in dry sand, and you turn the bell slowly, making sure that no patch of bare brass still shows, that the paste has reached into every crevice and curve except the engraved band and the interior, which are tasks for later. Satisfied? You set the bell back down on the folded linen cloth, placing it upright this time, so that the mouth faces the ceiling and the crown rests on the cloth, a stable position that will let the paste dry evenly without pooling. You set aside the polishing pad, which is now heavy with spent paste and dark grey from the tarnish it has lifted, and you pour a little of the cold water from the dipper over your fingers, rubbing them together to remove the chalky residue before drying them on a clean corner of the flannel cloth. The bowl of paste you cover loosely with the damp cloth once more, though only a small amount remains, a thin layer around the bottom that you will use for the engraving and the interior when the time comes. The room around you has grown warmer, the fire having settled into a deep, glowing bed of embers that radiates a steady, gentle heat, and the scent of the vinegar and chalk has mellowed, blending with the smells of wood smoke, drying linen, and the faint, sweet aroma of the sage tea that still sits, cold and forgotten, in its cup by the window. You look at the bell standing there in its white coat, and you feel a quiet ease that comes from knowing the work is proceeding exactly as it should, each step following the last in a natural, unhurried sequence. The paste will need a short time to rest on the brass, not long, only as long as it takes for the mixture to dry to the point where it will lift away cleanly when you wipe it, taking the last of the tarnish with it and leaving behind only the bright, polished metal. This resting period is not idle time, but a necessary pause, a breath between two movements, and you use it to stretch your arms slowly, raising your hands above your head and feeling the gentle pull in your shoulders and along the sides of your back. You roll your shoulders a few times, listening to the small soft pops that your joints make, and then you let your arms fall back to your sides, feeling loose and settled, the way a cat settles after a long stretch in a sunbeam. The stool creaks under you as you shift your weight, a sound that has become as familiar as the ticking of a clock in a house that has one, and you fold your hands on the table in front of you, simply looking at the white bell and waiting. Outside the window, the market square remains quiet, though a few of the town's earliest risers have now begun to move about their own slow morning tasks. You can hear the distant, irregular sound of a bolt being drawn back on a shop door, the faint clatter of a wooden bucket being set down near the well, and the thin, distant barking of a dog somewhere at the far end of the town, a sound that carries through the clear air and fades as quickly as it came. These noises do not disturb the peace of your cottage. They simply remind you that the town is waking, that you are not alone in the world, and that the proclamation you will deliver later today will be heard by real people going about their real lives. The thought does not make you anxious, because the proclamation is not a performance but a service, a simple transmission of words from the crown to the ears of the townsfolk, and you are only the instrument that carries them, as the bell is the instrument that carries the sound. You watch the paste on the bell begin to change as it dries, the greyish colour lightening to a pale, chalky white once more, and the film taking on a slightly frosted appearance, as if the bell had been left outside on a night of heavy dew that froze before dawn. Tiny cracks appear in the paste, fine as spider silk, where the drying has caused the chalk to contract, and these cracks branch and cross each other in a random pattern that has no meaning but is pleasing to look at, the way the veins of a dry leaf are pleasing. The process of drying is slow and silent, and you follow it with your eyes in the same way you might watch the slow drift of a cloud, with no expectation and no hurry, only a quiet acceptance of the pace that nature has set. When the paste has dried enough that it no longer feels tacky when you touch it with the tip of your pinky, you know the resting time is over, and you lift the bell carefully by the leather strap, holding it over the table while you reach for the damp cloth you used earlier. The damp cloth is still cool and moist, having retained enough water from its earlier soaking to be effective, but not so much that it will drip onto the clean brass, and you fold it into a clean square, presenting a fresh surface to the bell. You begin at the crown, just below the soldered loop, and you wipe downward with long, slow strokes that follow the curve of the metal. The dried paste lifts away in a fine, pale dust that clings to the damp cloth and leaves the brass beneath completely clean, a gold so bright and pure that it seems to emit its own light, a sunburst captured in metal. You wipe the entire outer surface in this same methodical way, moving around the bell, refreshing the cloth by turning it to a clean section, until no trace of the paste remains. Then you take the dry flannel and buff the bell once more, short, rapid strokes that bring up the deep, liquid shine you have been working toward. The brass now glows with a warmth that makes the room feel lighter, and you set the bell upright on its base of folded linen, the outer surface fully polished, fully bright, a thing of beauty made from simple patience and care. The engraving and the interior still wait, and you will address them next, but for now you allow yourself a moment of simple looking, letting the polished brass catch the light and hold it, a quiet reward for quiet work. The polished outer surface of the bell stands before you in the full light of the advancing morning, a dome of warm gold that throws a soft reflection onto the whitewashed wall behind the table, a patch of moving light that sways gently when you shift the bell even a fraction of an inch. You have wiped away every trace of the dried paste, and the brass from crown to rim is as smooth and bright as a mirror that has just been cleaned with vinegar and newspaper, though the reflection it holds is not a sharp one, but a gentle, curved distortion of the room, the window, the beams, and your own quiet face looking back at you like a companion who has been there all along. The outer work is complete, and you let that knowledge settle in your mind without any rush to move on, because the inner curve and the engraved band are tasks of a different kind, tasks that require a smaller touch and a slower pace, and you want to approach them with the same calm readiness that you brought to the dome and the waist. The bell still stands upright on its folded linen base, the mouth open to the ceiling, and when you look down into it, you see the dark hollow of the interior, a shadowed space that the window light cannot fully reach. The inner curve slopes away from the lip in a smooth, concave wall that narrows as it rises toward the crown, and suspended in that hollow space the iron clapper hangs from its leather thong, still and silent, a dark shape against the dim brass. The interior has not been polished in the same way as the outside, and it shows a fine, greyish coating that you noted during your inspection, a powder that has settled there from the repeated striking of the clapper, and the slow accumulation of dust, drawn in by the ringing of the bell. This coating is not thick, but it is enough to dull the inner surface and slightly deaden the sound, because a bell's voice depends as much on the smoothness of its inner wall as on the cleanness of its outer one, each vibration needing a pure, unblemished surface to travel across. You reach into the bell with 2 fingers, feeling the inner curve without looking, and the metal under your touch is cool and faintly gritty, a texture that must be lifted away before the bell can sing with its full, clear note. The first thing you do is remove the clapper, because polishing the interior with the clapper in place would be awkward and would risk bending the leather thong or knocking the iron rod against the freshly cleaned outer surface. You reach inside the bell with both hands, one to steady the bell itself, and the other to find the small leather strap that holds the clapper to the crown, working by touch in the dim interior, where your fingers are your only guide. The leather is thin and slightly warm from resting inside the bell, and you trace it upward until you feel the wooden peg that passes through the loop and holds the clapper in place. A simple friction fit that has never failed you. You grip the peg between your thumb and forefinger and pull it gently sideways, rocking it back and forth with a tiny, patient motion until it slides free of its hole and the clapper comes loose in your hand. A smooth iron rod with a rounded bulb at the striking end and an eye at the top where the thong is tied. You lift the clapper out through the mouth of the bell and set it aside on a clean corner of the linen cloth, laying it down gently so that it does not roll, and the bell is now an empty vessel, a hollow brass shape waiting to be cleaned from the inside. The paste you made earlier still sits in its wooden bowl, a small amount remaining around the bottom, and you stir it again with the hazel twig to bring it back to a workable cream, adding a single drop of water from the dipper when you feel it has thickened too much during the wait. The paste softens and glistens, and you dip the thin strip of linen into it, the strip you have kept folded and ready for this exact purpose, working the paste into the fibers until the cloth is coated, but not overloaded. Then you wrap the strip around your right index finger, winding it carefully so that it forms a snug, padded sleeve that covers the fingertip and extends down to the first knuckle, the end tucked under to hold it in place. This finger wrapping is a technique you learned so long ago you cannot remember who first showed it to you, and it allows you to reach into curved spaces with a precision that a flat cloth in the palm can never achieve, turning your finger into a small, sensitive polishing tool that can feel every contour of the metal. You steady the bell with your left hand, tilting it slightly toward the window so that as much light as possible can reach the interior, and you insert your wrapped finger into the mouth, reaching down into the hollow space until the padded tip touches the inner curve near the lip. The contact is light at first, and you begin to move your finger in the same small circles you used on the outside, though these circles are necessarily tighter, confined by the narrow space, and you work the paste onto the metal with a gentle probing motion. The sensation under your finger is different from the outer polishing, because you cannot see what you are doing and must rely entirely on touch, feeling the grittiness of the old dust and the gradual smoothing as the paste does its work. The inner curve, like the outer one, is a smooth, unadorned surface with no engravings or edges, and you can cover it in broad, overlapping strokes once you have established the initial contact, moving your finger in arcs that follow the shape of the bell and reach as far toward the crown as your finger will allow. The sound of this interior polishing is even softer than the outer work, a faint, muffled hush that is trapped inside the bell and escapes only as a low whisper, as if the metal were murmuring to itself while you clean it. You work slowly, paying attention to the area where the clapper strikes, the small circular patch of brighter brass that you noted during your inspection, making sure that the paste reaches fully around that spot and lifts the dark halo of iron particles that had embedded themselves there. Your finger moves in and out, a slow rhythmic motion that reminds you of the way a baker works flour into the corners of a kneading trough, and you refresh the paste on the cloth twice more, each time taking only a tiny amount, because too much paste inside the bell would be difficult to wipe away and might leave a residue in the narrow space near the crown. When the entire inner curve that your finger can reach has been coated with a thin layer of paste, you withdraw your hand and unwrap the strip of linen from your finger, setting it aside. The inside of the bell now looks paler than before, the paste showing as a faint ghostly white in the dim light, and you know that wiping it clean will require a different approach, because you cannot reach all the way inside with a flat cloth in your hand alone. For this you have prepared a second damp rag, twisted into a long, narrow rope that you can insert into the bell and work around the interior with a gentle turning motion. The way a chimney sweep works, a brush up a flue. You dampen this rag with a few drops of water, squeezing out the excess until it is merely cool and moist, and you feed one end into the bell, turning it slowly between your palms so that the cloth rotates against the inner curve, lifting the spent paste and the grey dust together. You repeat this rotation several times, drawing the cloth out and repositioning it until a clean section of the rag comes out without any grey smears, and you know the interior is clean. You hold the bell up to the window and peer inside, tilting it until the light catches the inner wall, and you see the same warm golden glow that shines on the outside, the deep mirror-like polish extending all the way up to the shadowed crown. The interior is now as bright as you can make it, and you set the bell back on its base with a quiet sense of completion. The engraved band that circles the waist of the bell is the next part of the work, and in some ways it is the most demanding, because the grooves are fine and closely spaced, and they have been clogged for some time with the dried residue of past polishings. You lean closer to the bell and study the band once more, running a fingertip over the crest, with its sheaf of wheat, its crossed keys, and the carefully incised numerals of the date 1592, feeling the roughness where old paste has hardened into a pale, crusty line that follows the contours of each letter and symbol. The engraving is not deep, perhaps only 0.5 millimeter at its deepest point, but it is enough to trap any polish that is pressed into it. And over the years you have learned that cleaning it requires patience more than strength, a willingness to sit with a tiny tool and work each groove individually until the metal is free of all obstruction. From the row of cloths on the table, you select the smallest one, a scrap of linen no larger than a postage stamp that has been folded and folded again into a tight, pointed triangle with a tip as fine as the nib of a quill. You dip this tiny point into the fresh paste, picking up only a speck of the white cream, and you bring it to the engraving, touching it to the first groove of the sheaf of wheat with the care of a scribe touching ink to parchment. The paste transfers from the cloth to the groove in a thin white line, and you work it gently back and forth with the very tip of the point, pressing it into the cut without letting it spill over onto the surrounding polished surface. The motion is tiny, a mere tremor of the fingers, and it produces no sound at all, only a silent, focused attention that narrows your whole world down to a single groove of brass no longer than your thumbnail. You work your way around the entire band with the same methodical care, following each element of the design in turn, the curving stalks of the wheat sheaf, the straight shafts and round bows of the crossed keys, the sweeping serifs of the Roman numerals. Each groove takes a small amount of paste, a small amount of rubbing, and then a careful wipe with the very tip of a clean, dry cloth to remove the spent paste before it can harden again. The process is slow, so slow that if you were to count the minutes they would stack up into what might seem like an unreasonable amount of time for such a small area, but you do not count the minutes, you only count the grooves, moving from one to the next in a sequence that has no end except the completion of the circle. The engraved band is a record of the town's identity, cast into the bell by a founder who worked more than half a century before you were born, and cleaning it feels less like a task and more like an act of quiet preservation. A small service paid to the craftsman who made the bell and to the town that has kept it. Some of the grooves have hardened paste that resists the pointed cloth, and for these you reach for the softened twig you prepared earlier, a short length of hazel that you have chewed gently at one end to fray the wood into a soft, fibrous brush. The twig sits on the table where you left it, and you pick it up now, testing the frayed end against your fingertip to make sure it is soft enough not to scratch the brass, and then you bring it to the stubborn grooves, working the frayed fibers into the cut with a light, picking motion that loosens the dried powder. The twig is effective in a way that the cloth alone cannot be, reaching into the microscopic roughness of the cut and lifting out the tiny particles of chalk that have bonded with the brass. And as you work, a fine pale dust falls onto the linen cloth beneath the bell, a dust so fine it could be mistaken for flour if you did not know its origin. You follow the twig with the pointed cloth, wiping away the loosened residue, and the groove emerges clean and dark, a crisp line that holds a shadow even in the brightest light. The words and symbols that make up the engraving begin to stand out with a new clarity as you work, the contrast between the polished, bright surface and the dark, crisp grooves becoming sharper with every groove you clean. The sheaf of wheat, which before had looked like a blurred smudge, now reveals its individual stalks, each one a separate line that curves and tapers at the tip. The crossed keys, the symbol of the town's ancient charter, show their wards and notches with a precision that speaks of the engraver's steady hand, and the date, 1592, arranged in a neat row beneath the crest, reads as clearly as the day it was cut. You follow each numeral with the tip of the twig, and then with the cloth, and the 4 digits emerge in their proper order: 1, 5, 9, 2, a year that has long since passed into the records of the Guildhall, but that remains here, inscribed in brass, a permanent witness to the bell's beginning. The entire engraved band takes a long time to clean, longer than the outer surface or the interior, because there is no way to hurry work that is measured in millimeters. Your back has grown slightly stiff from leaning over the table, and you straighten up now and then to ease the muscles, rolling your shoulders and flexing your fingers before bending to the task again. Each time you return to the engraving, your eyes find a new groove to address, a tiny pocket of white that you had missed before, and you address it with the same calm patience you have brought to everything else. There is no frustration in this, only a quiet persistence that moves through the work like water through a slow stream, never rushing, never stopping, always finding the next place that needs attention. When the last groove has been cleaned and wiped, you take the dry flannel and buff the entire engraved band with a single, careful finger, pressing the cloth into the grooves just enough to remove any final dust without pulling at the sharp edges of the cuts. The band now stands out against the polished waste, like a line of dark script on a gilded page, every detail sharp and legible, and you trace a fingertip over the cleaned engraving, feeling the crisp edges and the smooth, empty grooves that your work has restored. The crest of the town, which you have known since you were a child, seems to look back at you with a fresh dignity, the sheaf of wheat and the crossed keys no longer hidden under a veil of old polish, but standing proud and clear. You set the flannel aside and sit back on the stool, surveying the bell in its entirety, the bright outer dome, the clean interior curve, the sharply defined band of the crest. The brass catches the light from the window and scatters it across the room in small, warm reflections that dance on the ceiling beams and the whitewashed walls, and the air around the table smells clean and faintly metallic, with just a trace of linseed oil lingering like a soft, nutty memory. The bell is almost ready, its polishing nearly complete. Only the clapper and the leather strap remain to be attended to, and these are small tasks that will bring the whole work to a close. For now, though, you simply sit and look at the gleaming bell, letting the quiet satisfaction of the work done so far fill you with a calm, steady warmth, the way the heat from the embers in the hearth fills the room without any need for flame. The bell sits before you in a state of near completion, its outer surface gleaming with a soft golden light that seems to come from somewhere deep inside the metal, the engraved band crisp and dark and full of shadow, the interior as clean as a new bowl. The paste bowl is empty now, a faint chalky residue dried around its rim, and you carry it to the basin by the hearth, where you rinse it with cold water from the bucket and scrub the inside with a twist of straw until the wood shows its pale, bare grain. You set the bowl on its side on the hearthstone to dry, the water droplets slowly gathering into a single wobbling bead that catches the ember light before falling away. The damp cloths you have used for wiping lie in a small heap on the corner of the table, each one stained with greyish streaks from the spent paste, and you collect them together, fold them into a rough square, and place them in a willow basket that you keep near the door for cloths that need washing. You will rinse them in the stream behind the cottage later, when the day's work is fully done. But for now, they are out of the way, and the table around the bell is clear of everything except the bell itself, the leather buffing pad, a small pot of linseed oil, and the clean square of dry flannel. The working space is simple and orderly, the clutter of preparation reduced to a few essential tools, and the clear tabletop feels like a fresh page waiting for the last lines of a long, careful letter. The leather buffing pad is a thing of quiet beauty in its own right, a circle of cowhide about the size of a dessert plate, backed with a layer of raw wool that has been felted into a dense, springy cushion. The leather side is smooth and dark from decades of use, the natural brown deepened to a rich chestnut that glows with a waxy sheen where the oils from your hands have polished the surface over time. The edges of the pad are slightly frayed, tiny fibers of leather lifting away where the pad is rubbed against brass and table and the inside of its storage box. But the center is still firm and flat, the perfect surface for the final buffing of a well-polished bell. The wool backing is a creamy off-white, matted into a thick nap that fits comfortably in the palm of your hand and absorbs the pressure of your grip, distributing it evenly across the leather face. You pick up the pad and hold it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, the way it molds to your curved fingers, and you breathe in the scent of old leather and wool that clings to it. A smell that reminds you of a saddler's workshop you once visited as a boy, a place of quiet industry and the patient shaping of hide into useful things. You turn your attention back to the bell, which rests on its folded linen base with the mouth facing slightly upward, the polished brass throwing the window light across the ceiling in a wavering, liquid reflection that moves whenever a cloud passes over the sun. The bell's surface is clean and free of all paste, but it is not yet complete, because polishing with paste leaves a surface that is smooth and bright, but still carries the microscopic tracks of the abrasive particles. A fine haze that can only be removed by the friction of leather and the gentle heat of buffing. This final step transforms a clean bell into a gleaming one, deepening the shine from a bright gold to a warm, almost translucent glow that seems to hold the light within the metal rather than simply reflecting it. And you are looking forward to this transformation with the same quiet anticipation that you would feel before the final stroke of a whetstone on a blade that is already sharp. You lift the bell carefully by its leather strap, holding it in your left hand so that the outer surface is exposed and accessible, and you bring it closer to your face, looking at the brass once more in the strong light from the window. The reflection that meets your eyes is clear and smooth, but when you tilt the bell very slowly, you can see a faint, milky film that shifts across the surface like the bloom on a ripe plum, a residue that is invisible when the bell is still but shows itself when the angle of the light changes. This is the fine chalky trace left behind by the paste, a dust so fine that the damp cloth could not lift it all, and it is for this trace that the leather pad exists, because only the gentle, persistent rubbing of a soft, oiled hide can lift that final veil and reveal the true depth of the brass. You breathe onto the curve of the bell, a slow, warm exhale that mists the metal with a thin layer of condensation, the way a mirror fogs when you hold it close to your mouth in a cold room, and immediately the faint bloom becomes visible as a pale, ghostly circle that marks the boundary of your breath. Before the condensation can evaporate, you bring the leather pad to the misted surface and begin to rub it in long, even strokes that follow the natural curve of the bell from crown to rim. The motion is different from the small circles of the paste polishing. It is a broader, more sweeping gesture, the pad held flat against the brass and moved with a steady, unbroken pressure that travels the full length of the dome. The leather, warmed by your hand and by the friction of the rubbing, glides over the metal with a soft, wheezing sound, a low, continuous shush that is the voice of the final polish, a sound so gentle and regular that it merges into the background noises of the room and becomes part of the quiet itself, like the distant murmur of wind in the chimney. The sensation under your hand is of a smooth, warm slide, the pad gathering up the microscopic dust and carrying it away, and after each stroke you lift the pad and turn it slightly so that a fresh section of the leather makes contact, distributing the wear evenly across the surface of the hide. You work the buffing pad across the entire outer surface of the bell with this same patient, sweeping motion, overlapping each stroke with the last by a small margin so that no area is missed, and you rotate the bell in your hand as you go, bringing each section into the best light and then moving it away again. A slow, continuous dance of hand and metal and leather that has no hurry and no destination except the gradual deepening of the shine. The leather pad absorbs the faint warmth that the friction generates, a warmth that is not hot but merely tepid, like a stone that has been sitting in the sun, and you can feel this warmth through the wall backing as a mild, pleasant glow against your palm, a tactile reward for the steady work. As you buff, the shine on the brass grows deeper and more liquid, the bright, mirror-like gleam of the freshly polished metal softening into a richer, mellower luster, the color shifting from pale gold to the deep amber of aged honey held up to a candle flame. You pause occasionally to hold the bell up and inspect it, turning it this way and that against the window, and you watch the reflections change, the ceiling beam, the window frame, your own calm face, all bending across the curved surface in a distorted but recognizable parade of images that move with the movement of the bell. The face that looks back at you from the polished brass is a quiet, weathered face, the face of a man who has spent many years in the open air of the market square and many hours in the still light of this cottage. A face with lines at the corners of the eyes and a slight droop to the skin under the chin. but the expression it holds is serene, the expression of someone who is entirely absorbed in a simple task and expects nothing more from the moment than what the moment is already giving. You do not study your reflection with any particular interest, but you note it in passing, the same way you note the reflection of the window frame or the ceiling beam as just another piece of the world caught in the polished curve of the bell, and you move on to the next section of the buffing without pausing to dwell. The leather pad has now covered the entire outer dome and waist, and you shift your attention to the rim, the thick, rolled lip that forms the bell's mouth, which requires a slightly different technique because its surface is convex and narrow. You fold the leather pad in half, creating a curved edge that fits neatly against the rolled brass, and you buff the rim with short, back-and-forth strokes that follow the circle of the mouth, working your way around the entire circumference without lifting the pad more than necessary. The buffing of the rim produces a slightly different sound, a higher, drier whisper that has a faintly scratchy quality, because the surface area is smaller and the friction is more concentrated, but the result is the same, a deepening of the shine and a removal of the last invisible haze. When the rim is complete, you unfold the pad and inspect it, and the leather side now has a faint, golden smear across its surface. Not a stain, but a polishing of the hide itself, the brass having deposited a minute amount of its own substance onto the leather, a transfer so fine that it is more an idea of color than a visible mark. The inner curve of the bell, which you cleaned earlier with a wrapped finger, cannot be reached effectively with the large buffing pad, so for this you take a smaller piece of the same leather, a circle about the size of a coin that you keep for tight spaces, and you work it inside the bell with a careful rotating motion, pressing it against the inner wall with your fingers and turning it slowly until the interior too develops that same warm liquid glow. The small pad disappears into the bell's mouth, and you work blind, feeling the gentle resistance of the leather against the brass and the slight heat that builds under your fingertips, trusting your touch to tell you when the surface is smooth and fully buffed. When you withdraw the small pad, the interior looks, as far as you can see, as bright as the outside, the concave wall holding the light and bouncing it back in a warm golden halo that fills the hollow space. The buffing of the bell is almost complete, and you hold the bell up one more time to inspect it from every angle, turning it slowly in the light from the window. The brass now has a deep, quiet glow that seems to come from within the metal itself, a gleam that is not harsh or glittering, but soft and almost buttery, the kind of shine that a well-cared-for piece of old brass develops over generations. The reflection of the room in the bell is, at this point, so clear that you can see the individual fibers of the ceiling beam and the wavy lines in the window glass, though these details are stretched and curved by the convex surface into a sort of visual melody that is pleasing to follow with your eyes. You run a fingertip over the polished brass and feel nothing but a cool liquid smoothness, the surface so uniform and flawless that your finger glides without any resistance, as if the metal had been coated in a thin layer of oil, though it is dry and clean. Just near the crown, however, where the soldered lute for the leather strap joins the dome of the bell, you notice a small subtle cloudiness that you had not seen before. It is not a smear or a patch of tarnish, but a faint, milky opacity that sits on the surface like a breath on a cold morning. A spot no larger than the pad of your thumb, almost imperceptible, except when the light strikes it at exactly the wrong angle. You tilt the bell back and forth, catching the cloudiness and losing it and catching it again, and you recognize it as a small area of microscopic roughness, probably left by the soldering flux that had splashed the brass when the handle was originally attached, a flaw that was always there but that your polishing has now made visible by contrast with the perfect shine around it. This spot is not a defect in any practical sense, because it will never affect the bell's voice or its function, but you know it is there, and you know that a little extra attention will lift it and blend it into the overall gleam. You reach for the small clay pot of linseed oil and remove the cork, which comes out with a soft popping sound, releasing the warm, nutty fragrance of the oil into the air around the table. The oil inside is thick and golden, the color of weak tea, and you dip just the very tip of your smallest finger into it, picking up a bead of oil no larger than a mustard seed. You touch this bead to the cloudy spot on the bell and spread it in a thin, circular film that covers the entire affected area. the oil sitting on the brass like a clear amber lens that magnifies the metal beneath. Then you take the leather pad again and return to the spot, rubbing the oiled area with small, rapid circles that generate a little more warmth than the earlier strokes, and the combination of oil and friction goes to work on the microscopic roughness, filling its tiny valleys and smoothing its microscopic peaks until the cloudiness begins to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, the way a mist lifts from a valley as the morning warms. You work the spot until your hand feels the surface become uniform under the leather, and when you wipe away the excess oil with a corner of the dry flannel, the cloudiness is gone, absorbed into the overall shine, and the bell from crown to rim is one continuous, unblemished surface of glowing brass. You set the leather pad down on the table, its work finished, and you take up the clean square of flannel for the absolute final polish. A light, brisk rubbing that removes any last traces of oil and brings the shine to its ultimate state. The flannel is soft and dry and faintly warm from resting near the fire, and you pass it over the entire bell in quick, feathery strokes, not pressing down but merely skimming the surface, and the brass responds with a brilliance that seems to push back the shadows in the room and fill the corners with a golden, reflected light. The bell, now fully buffed and polished, is no longer merely a bell. It is a small sun sitting on your table, a thing of quiet radiance that seems to have gathered all the light of the morning and concentrated it into a single portable shape. You place the bell upright on its felt base, with the care of a sacristan returning a chalice to the altar, and you sit back on the wooden stool, your hands resting on your thighs, your breathing slow and deep. The polished brass holds the morning light like honey held in a cup, a thick golden glow that seems almost drinkable, and the reflections it casts on the walls and the ceiling and the window glass move gently whenever a breeze stirs the air, a soft, undulating dance of light that plays across the whitewashed plaster without any sound. The room itself feels transformed, not by any dramatic change, but by the simple presence of a beautifully polished bell, a small, perfect object that has absorbed your attention and returned it in the form of a quiet, steady satisfaction that asks for nothing more than to be felt. The buffing is done and the bell is ready, and you sit in the warmth of the morning and let that readiness fill the silence. The bell rests upright on its felt base, the polished brass throwing a soft, steady glow across the tabletop that makes the wood grain look like a map of gentle rivers and low hills, and you sit for a while without moving, your hands folded loosely in your lap, letting the quiet of the room settle around the completed outer work before you turn to the smaller pieces that still need attention. The clapper and the leather strap are the bell's hidden companions, the parts that do the actual work of making sound, and though they have been cleaned and oiled many times before, each polishing of the bell is also an occasion to check them carefully, to make sure the iron is free of rust. The leather is supple and strong, and the wooden peg that holds everything together is sound and snug in its hole. These are not demanding tasks, but they require a different kind of attention than the broad sweeping motions of polishing brass, an attention that narrows down to the tiny details of metal and hide and wood, the small essential things that can be overlooked if one is in a hurry, and you are never in a hurry. You reach across the table to the clean corner of the linen cloth where you placed the clapper earlier, after you drew it out of the bell's interior, to make way for the polishing of the inner curve. The clapper lies there still, an iron rod about the length of your hand from the heel at your palm to the tip of your middle finger, with a rounded bulb at the lower end that does the striking, and a flattened eye at the upper end where the leather thong passes through. The iron is dark and matte, the surface bearing the fine grey-black patina of aged metal that has been handled and wrung and exposed to the air for many years, and here and there you can see tiny specks of reddish-brown, the earliest beginnings of rust, no larger than pinpricks, scattered along the rod like a dusting of cinnamon on a dark cake. The rust is not serious, nothing that threatens to eat into the metal or weaken the clapper, but it is there, and you will address it now while the bell is already being tended, the way a farmer mends a small tear in a sack before it becomes a large one. You pick up the clapper and hold it in your left hand, turning it slowly under the light from the window so that the iron catches the pale morning sun and reveals every tiny pit and speck. The bulb at the striking end is smooth and slightly brighter than the rest of the rod, because it is the part that repeatedly meets the inner curve of the bell, and the impact has worn a small circular patch of polished iron that gleams with a dark silvery luster, a match in miniature to the polished brass it strikes. Just above this polished patch, the iron darkens again and shows the fine granular texture of the original casting, a surface that is slightly rough to the touch but not unpleasantly so, like the feel of a well-used file handle. The eye at the top of the clapper is a simple loop forged into the iron, and through this loop the leather thong has been threaded, a thong of dark brown cowhide that is now dry and slightly stiff from age, its surface covered with a network of tiny cracks that show pale against the darker hide, the way dried mud cracks in the bottom of a puddle after a long drought. You place the clapper gently on a clean portion of the linen cloth and reach for the small clay pot of linseed oil that still sits on the table from your buffing work, its cork resting loosely in the opening. The oil is the same golden, nutty-scented substance you used to lift the cloudy patch on the bell, and it works just as well on iron as it does on brass, penetrating the tiny pores of the metal and the fibers of the leather alike, displacing moisture and sealing the surface against the air that brings rust and stiffness. You pour a single drop of the oil onto a clean scrap of linen, a square no larger than your thumbprint that you have reserved for this purpose, and you fold the scrap over your finger, rubbing the oil into the cloth until it is evenly spread and faintly shiny. Then you take up the clapper again and begin to wipe it from end to end with slow, thorough strokes that cover every part of the iron rod. The oiled cloth glides over the metal with a faint wet sound, a soft sighing whisper that is even quieter than the buffing of the bell, and as you work, the iron absorbs the oil greedily, the dark surface deepening to a richer, blacker shade that seems to swallow the light rather than reflect it. The tiny specks of rust come away on the cloth, leaving behind small, clean pits that are no longer red, but merely dark, harmless indentations that the oil will now protect. You focus on the areas where the rust had begun to gather, going over each pinprick carefully with the tip of the oiled cloth, working the oil into the tiny depressions with a gentle circular pressure that fills them and seals them. The motion is so small that your hand barely moves, only your fingers flexing slightly, and the task draws your face closer to the clapper, your breath slow and warm against the iron, until you can smell the clean metallic scent of the metal mingling with the nutty fragrance of the linseed oil, a combination that is sharp and soft at the same time, like the smell of a rain-wet stone that has been warmed by the sun. When the entire rod has been wiped and the rust specks are no longer visible, you set the clapper down and pick up the leather thong that hangs from its eye, drawing it through your fingers to feel its condition along its full length. The thong is a single strip of cowhide, cut from a larger piece and rolled between the hands until it forms a round, even cord about the thickness of a stout shoelace, its surface darkened by years of handling to a deep tawny brown that is almost black in the creases. As you pull it gently between your thumb and forefinger, you feel the stiffness that has crept into the leather over the months, a resistance that was not there when the thong was new, and you see the tiny cracks that cross its surface, fine as hairs, that come from the repeated flexing every time the bell is rung. The leather is not yet breaking, not yet at the point where it must be replaced, but it is dry and thirsty for the oil that will restore its suppleness and keep it strong for the many ringings to come. You have a small pot of neat's foot oil on a shelf near the hearth, a soft, yellowish oil that is rendered from the bones and feet of cattle and has been used by leather workers and saddlers for centuries to keep hide flexible and weatherproof. The pot is a squat stoneware jar with a wide mouth and a snug cork, and you fetch it now, carrying it to the table and setting it beside the linseed oil. The neat's foot oil has a different scent from the linseed, a warm animal smell that is not unpleasant, but faintly savory, like the smell of a clean tallow candle before it is lit, and you remove the cork and pour a very small pool of the oil into the palm of your left hand, no more than a few drops. The oil is pale and slightly cloudy, and it feels cool and slick against your skin as you work it between your palms, warming it with the friction of your hands until it becomes thinner and more fluid, ready to be applied. You take the leather thong between both hands and begin to work the oil into it, drawing the thong through your oiled fingers with a slow, steady pressure that forces the oil into the cracks and the pores of the hide. The leather darkens at once where the oil touches it, the pale cracks filling and disappearing, and a stiffness begins to ease as you work. the thong becoming more pliable and soft under your fingers, the way a dry sponge softens when it is dipped in water. You work your way from the eye of the clapper down to the free end of the thong, then back up again, repeating the motion several times until the leather has absorbed as much oil as it can hold and the surface feels smooth and moist without being greasy. The scent of the neat's foot oil fills the air around you, a rich, earthy smell that mingles with the linseed and the wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of the polished brass, and you pause once to bring the thong close to your face and smell it, checking for any sourness that might indicate rot, finding only the good, honest scent of well-cared-for leather. The wooden peg that holds the clapper in place inside the bell is the next small thing to be checked, and you retrieve it from where it has been lying on the table, a small cylinder of hard, close-grained beechwood about the length of your little finger and the thickness of a quill. The peg has been carved by hand, its surface marked with the faint, parallel lines of the knife that shaped it, and it is smooth from years of being pushed in and pulled out of its hole in the bell's crown. You hold the peg up to the light and turn it, looking for any splits or cracks that might cause it to fail, finding none. Only the dark, polished patina of wood that has been handled many times, and the slightly compressed area where the leather thong presses against it inside the bell. The peg is sound as you expected it to be, and you set it down again, satisfied, because a broken peg on the day of a proclamation would be a small but unnecessary trouble, and you believe in preventing troubles before they can arise. Now the clapper is clean and oiled, the thong is soft and pliable, and the peg is whole, so you reassemble the small mechanism that hangs inside the bell and gives it voice. You thread the free end of the leather thong through the loop at the crown of the bell from the inside, pulling it through carefully so that the clapper dangles freely inside the bell's hollow, the iron rod hanging straight down with the striking bulb centered in the mouth. You hold the bell upside down for a moment, letting the clapper settle into its natural position, and you watch the way it hangs, checking that the thong is not twisted, and that the clapper is aligned so that it will strike the inner curve squarely when the bell is swung. The alignment is correct, as it always is, because the thong has been shaped by use to hang in exactly this way, a memory of all the ringings that have come before. And you slide the wooden peg through the loop of the thong on the outside of the crown, pushing it firmly into its hole until it seats with a small, satisfying click that you feel more than hear. The main leather strap of the bell, the thick strap that passes through the crown loop and allows you to carry the bell or swing it to ring, is the last part of the assembly to receive your attention, and you lift the bell by this strap now, feeling its weight and the way the strap bears it. The strap is a broad, flat strip of oxhide, darkened by age and the oils of your hand, to a deep chocolate brown that is almost black along the edges, and it is longer than your arm, with a loop at one end that passes through the brass crown and a free end that hangs down with a neatly trimmed point. The surface of the strap is smooth along the middle, where your hand most often holds it, but the edges are slightly rough and you can see small fibers lifting away where the leather has rubbed against the brass loop over the years. A gradual, gentle wear that is natural and expected. You run the strap through your hands, feeling the thickness and the texture, and you find one place, about halfway along its length, where the leather has begun to feel a little thinner than the rest, a slight depression that you can feel between your thumb and forefinger, the beginning of a crease that might one day become a weak point, though it is not weak yet and may not be for many more years. You decide to give the entire strap a treatment with a neat's foot oil, the same oil you used on the clapper thong, because the leather is dry in the same way and will benefit from the moisture. You pour another small pool of oil into your palm and begin to work it into the strap, starting at the loop that passes through the crown and moving your hand down toward the free end, using long, even strokes that spread the oil into the surface without soaking it so deeply that the leather becomes floppy or over-softened. The strap darkens immediately under the oil, the brown deepening to a rich, dark mahogany, and the small fibers along the edges lie down and become smooth, the roughness disappearing under the slick, even coat. You pay special attention to the thin spot, working the oil into that area with a little extra pressure, massaging it gently until the leather there feels as supple as the rest of the strap, the depression still present, but now sealed and nourished. Its progression halted for another season. The scent of the neat's foot oil rises again as you work, and the strap, when you are finished, gleams with a quiet, healthy luster, the way a well-brushed horse's coat gleams in the sun, and you hang the strap over the back of a chair near the hearth, where the gentle warmth from the embers will help the oil to soak in and cure. The strap will need to rest for a short while before it is handled again, so you leave it there on the chair and return to the bell, which now stands fully assembled on the table, the polished brass glowing, the clapper hanging silently within. The wooden peg firmly in place, the leather strap draped nearby like a faithful hound waiting for its master's hand. You place one hand on the bell's crown to steady it, and with the other, you reach inside and touch the clapper lightly, giving it the smallest, most tentative shake, a motion so gentle that the clapper barely moves, just enough to tap the inner curve of the bell with a single, brief contact. The sound that results is not a ring, but a soft, low chime, a single note that rises from the brass like a bubble rising through still water, pure and round and perfectly clear. The note hangs in the air of the cottage for a long moment, a tone that is neither loud nor soft, but exactly right. A golden thread of sound that seems to weave itself into the silence before slowly fading away, the last ripple of its vibration absorbed by the whitewashed walls and the timbered ceiling and the wool of your tunic. You listen to the full decay of the note, holding your breath without realizing it, and when the sound is finally gone, you let your breath out in a slow, quiet sigh, because the bell's voice is intact and true, as clear as it was the day it was cast, and the work you have done has not altered it in any way except, perhaps, to make it a little more pure. You withdraw your hand from the bell and place both hands flat on the table, palms down, feeling the smooth, cool wood under your fingers, and you look at the bell one more time. A long, slow look that takes in the glowing brass, the dark iron clapper, just visible inside, the freshly oiled leather loop at the crown, where the strap will soon be threaded. The morning has moved on while you have been working, the sun now well above the rooftops, and the light in the cottage shifting from the pale gold of early day to the brighter light of mid-morning, and the fire in the hearth has settled into a bed of soft, white ash, with only a few orange embers still glowing through the grey. The bell is ready, the crier's tools are cared for, and the proclamation scroll on the writing desk waits with its red cord still tied, the words of the Assize Court opening still silent and unread. You are not quite ready to untie that cord, not yet, because the strap must rest a little longer, and your hands could use a few minutes of stillness after the long work of polishing. So you remain seated at the table, a quiet figure in a quiet room, the polished bell beside you like a small son that has come to rest in your cottage. And you wait, as you have waited many times before, for the next slow moment to arrive on its own. The polished bell stands on the table like a small silent sun, its glow undiminished by the passage of the minutes, and the oiled leather strap hangs over the back of the chair near the hearth where the gentle warmth from the dying embers is slowly working the neat's foot oil deeper into the fibers of the hide, softening and preserving it for the many months of use that lie ahead. Your hands are still now, resting on your thighs with the palms turned upward, the fingers slightly curled from the long work of polishing and buffing, but not cramped or painful, merely warm and a little stiff in the knuckles, the way hands feel after a morning spent in steady, repetitive motion. The room has grown quieter as the fire has settled, the occasional crackle and pop of the burning wood now replaced by a deep, soft hush that is broken only by the faint rustle of the breeze at the window and the distant, irregular sounds of the market town waking beyond the cottage walls. You have been sitting for some time without moving, letting the stillness seep into your bones the way water seeps into dry earth. And you feel rested now, ready to turn your attention from the bell to the words that the bell will announce. The writing desk in the corner of the room is a small, unassuming piece of furniture that you made yourself many years ago from a single plank of oak that had been salvaged from a dismantled stall in the market square. The desk has a sloping top that lifts on two small iron hinges to reveal a shallow compartment where you keep your quills and ink, and a few sheets of spare parchment. And below the sloping top, a single drawer holds sealing wax, a small knife for trimming quills, a length of linen thread, and a smooth river stone that you use for smoothing rough patches on new parchment. The surface of the desk is dark with age and marked with the pale rings left by wet cups and the faint scratches of the quill knife, and it sits against the wall beneath a small high window that lets in a narrow shaft of light, just enough to write by without straining your eyes. You rise from the stool slowly, pushing yourself up with the heels of your hands against your thighs, and you cross the room in a few quiet steps, the floorboards creaking softly under your weight, as they always do in the places where the joists have settled over the years. The Proclamation scroll lies on the desk where you left it the evening before, having fetched it from the Guildhall at the request of the clerk who had spent all of the previous day copying it out in his careful, unhurried hand. The scroll is a single sheet of good parchment, not the coarse greyish stuff used for market tallies and temporary notices, but a fine cream-coloured skin that has been scraped and pumised until it is smooth as polished ivory, its surface showing the faint parallel lines of the scribe's scoring tool that guided his text across the page. The sheet has been rolled tightly from the bottom up into a cylinder no thicker than a broom handle, and around its middle a length of red silk cord has been tied in a simple bow, the ends trailing down in two small loops that look like the folded wings of a resting butterfly. The cord is not merely decorative. It serves to keep the scroll closed and clean during its journey from the Guildhall to the Crier's cottage and then back again. And the colour red is the traditional colour of royal proclamations, a small but deliberate mark of the authority that stands behind the words inside. You stand before the desk and look down at the scroll for a moment, letting the sight of it settle into your mind, the way you let the sight of the unpolished bell settle before you began to work on it. The proclamation you are about to read is not a surprise to you, because you have announced the opening of the Assize Court many times before, and the words, though they vary slightly from year to year in their details, follow a pattern that you know as well as you know the streets of the town. The Assize Courts are the travelling courts of the Crown, sent out from London twice a year to bring the King's justice to the counties of England, and their opening is a moment of solemn importance, a reminder that the law is not a distant abstraction but a living presence that walks into the Guildhall in the persons of the justices and sits in judgment over real disputes and real crimes. Your role is not to interpret the law or to argue it, but simply to announce it, to carry the words from the parchment to the ears of the people with a voice that is clear and steady and loud enough to be heard across the square. And you take this role seriously without taking it grandly, the way a miller takes the grinding of grain seriously without pretending that he is a baker. You reach down and pick up the scroll with both hands, holding it lightly by the ends, and the parchment feels cool and slightly springy against your fingers, the rolled sheet retaining the memory of its curve and gently resisting your grip. You carry it back to the table by the window, where the light is better, and you set it down on the cleared surface beside the polished bell, pushing aside a stray scrap of linen to make room. Then you return to the desk and fetch the two smooth river stones that you keep in the drawer, stones that you collected years ago from the bed of the stream that runs along the eastern edge of the town, worn into perfect oval shapes by centuries of water flowing over them. The stones are cool and heavy in your hands, a dark speckled grey that gleams with a faint, wet-looking luster when the light catches them, and they are just the right weight to hold a sheet of parchment flat without crushing it or leaving marks, a purpose they have served hundreds of times before. You place the stones on the table beside the scroll, and then you sit down on the stool once more, drawing it closer to the table so that you can lean comfortably over the parchment. The red silk cord comes untied with a single gentle pull on one of the trailing ends, the bow loosening and the cord slipping free of the scroll with a soft, whispering sound, the sound of silk moving against itself, and you coil the cord loosely around your fingers and set it aside on the corner of the table where it will not be lost. The scroll, freed of its binding, immediately begins to unroll itself, the tight cylinder relaxing into a looser curve, and you place one hand on it to control the unrolling while you position the first river stone at the top edge of the sheet, weighting it down securely before you slowly flatten the rest of the parchment across the table and anchor the bottom corners with the second stone. The scroll now lies open before you, a rectangle of creamy parchment that covers almost the full width of the tabletop, and the text that it bears is revealed in the clear light of the window. The proclamation is written in a careful, formal hand, the kind of script known as secretary hand, which is used for legal documents in official correspondence throughout the kingdom. The letters are small and regular, formed with a thin-nibbed quill that has left strokes of varying thickness according to the pressure and direction of the scribe's hand, and the ink is a deep, sooty black that has dried to a soft, matte finish, the color of charcoal rather than the glossy black of fresh ink. The capital letters at the beginning of each sentence are larger and more ornate, decorated with small flourishes that curl and loop around the main stem, and the Latin phrases that are scattered through the text are written in a slightly different, more angular hand, as if the scribe had switched to a different script, the way a man might change his coat to go into a church. The parchment itself has a faint, pleasant smell that rises as it lies open, a smell of clean animal skin and old chalk and a trace of something sharper that might be the residue of the oak gall ink, a scent that speaks of quiet afternoons in a scriptorium, where nothing moves but the nib of a quill and nothing sounds but the scratch of ink on skin. You lean forward and place your elbows on the table, cradling your chin in your hands, and you begin to read the proclamation silently, your lips moving just slightly as you trace each line with your eyes. The text is written in English, but it is a formal legal English that is full of words like herein, thereof, aforesaid, and heretofore, words that twist and double back on themselves like a path through a dense wood, and you read them slowly, untangling the meaning as you go. The proclamation begins with the traditional call to attention, the threefold oyez that the townspeople will hear when you stand in the square and lift the bell, and then it moves into the body of the announcement, naming the king's justices who will sit in the assize, the date and hour of the opening, the duties of the jurors and witnesses, and the general charge to all good subjects of the crown to attend and give their obedience to the court. The language is repetitive and stately, the same phrases appearing again and again in slightly different arrangements, and this repetition is not a flaw but a feature, because it ensures that the meaning is clear and that nothing is omitted, the way a builder doubles the nails in a beam to make certain it will hold. One passage near the middle of the proclamation catches your attention for a moment longer than the rest, a paragraph that lists the types of cases that the Assize Court will hear, pleas of the Crown, which are the serious criminal matters reserved for the King's justices, including murder, robbery, and the stealing of livestock. You read this list with the same calm attention that you give to everything else, noting the words but not dwelling on them, because the content of the proclamation is not your concern, only its delivery, and your task is to speak these words clearly and evenly, without emphasis or emotion, the way a bell simply rings without caring what it rings for. The list of offences is followed by a list of the towns and villages that fall within the jurisdiction of the court, names that you know well because you have walked to every one of them at some point in your life, and you read them slowly, picturing the church steeples and the market crosses and the stone bridges that mark each place. You have read the entire proclamation through once, silently, and now you read it again, this time paying closer attention to the rhythm of the sentences, the places where a breath will be needed, the phrases that are likely to trick the tongue if they are spoken too quickly. You reach across the table and open the small drawer that is built into its underside, a drawer you did not open during the polishing because it had no role to play in that work. And you take out a quill and a small heavy pot of ink that is sealed with a cork and a layer of wax around the rim to keep the ink from drying out. The quill is a goose feather that you have cut and trimmed yourself, the barb stripped away from the lower part of the shaft to leave a clean, easy grip, and the nib is fine, but not too fine, capable of making a small, precise mark without scratching through the parchment. The ink pot is made of thick, dark glass, its sides stained with old drips and smears, and you break the wax seal with your thumbnail, working it loose in small crumbly flakes that you gather in your palm and set aside. The ink inside is the same oak gall ink used by the scribe, a liquid so dark it looks black in the pot, but turns a faint brownish grey when it dries, and you dip the nib into it carefully, tapping the excess against the rim of the pot to avoid blots. With the quill poised over the parchment, you begin to make small marks in the margin beside the text, a system of notation that you have developed over the years and that only you understand. A single tiny tick placed just above a word marks the spot where you will pause for a brief breath, a half-beat of silence that will let the listeners absorb what has just been said before the next phrase comes. A double tick, two small lines angled together like the peak of a roof, marks the places where you will ring the bell, once at the very beginning of the proclamation to call the people to attention, and once at the end to mark that the announcement is complete. A faint dotted line curving between two words reminds you to slow down at that point, to give the words extra weight without raising your voice, and a small circle around a Latin phrase means that you must pronounce it carefully, separating the syllables so that the meaning is not lost in a foreign jumble. You work your way through the entire proclamation with these tiny marks, pausing to dip the quill again when the ink runs thin, and the marginal notes accumulate beside the text like the tracks of a small, careful bird that has walked alongside the lines. The marking takes as long as the reading did, perhaps longer, because each tick and circle must be placed with precision so that it serves its purpose without distracting your eye during the actual delivery. You do not rush this part of the work any more than you rush the polishing of the bell, and the quiet of the room is broken only by the faint, scratchy sound of the quill on the parchment, a sound that is not unpleasant, but rather companionable, the sound of a small, focused task being carried out with patience and attention. When the last mark is made, a single tick at the very end of the final sentence, you set the quill down on a scrap of cloth and seal the ink pot with a fresh dab of softened wax, pressing it down with your thumb until it hardens. The proclamation is now ready to be practiced aloud, the silent reading and the marking having prepared the ground for the spoken word, the way the mixing of the paste and the selection of the cloths prepared the ground for the polishing of the bell. You sit back on the stool and rub your eyes gently with the heels of your hands, feeling the slight pleasant tiredness that comes from close reading, and you let your gaze drift around the room, resting on the familiar objects that furnish your life: the polished bell, the oiled strap, the bowl drying on the hearth, the cup of cold sage tea that you still have not finished. The morning light has now reached its full brightness, a clear, white light that fills the cottage and makes the dust motes dance in their slow, spiraling currents. And the sounds from the town beyond the window are more frequent now, the distant murmur of voices and the occasional creak of a cartwheel on cobbles, the ordinary music of a market town going about its ordinary day. The proclamation waits for you on the table, its marked text ready to be spoken, and you feel a quiet readiness of your own, a settling of your breath and your mind into the calm, steady state that you will need when you stand in the square and lift your voice. That moment is not here yet, and you are in no hurry to meet it, but you can feel it drawing closer, the way the tide draws closer to the shore, and you rest your hands on the table and wait for the next slow impulse that will carry you forward. The marked proclamation lies open on the table before you, its neat rows of black script, accompanied now by the tiny ticks and circles and dotted lines that you have scattered along the margins, a private map that only you can read, a guide that will keep your voice steady and your breath even when the moment comes to stand in the square and raise the bell. The quill and ink have been put away, the stones still hold the corners of the parchment flat, and the polished bell sits at the edge of the table like a silent listener, its deep golden glow reflecting a warm, distorted image at the window and the sky beyond. You have been sitting for some time after finishing the marking, letting your eyes rest and your mind settle, and now you feel the quiet impulse that means you are ready to begin the next stage of the work. The stage where the words move from the page to your mouth and from your mouth to the air of the room, spoken not in the full voice you will use in the square, but in a low, private murmur that is meant only for the walls and the beams and your own ears. You rise from the stool slowly, your legs feeling the slight stiffness that comes from sitting still for a long while, and you pick up the scroll with both hands, lifting it carefully so that the river stones roll back onto the table with a soft, solid clunk against the wood. The parchment curls slightly at the edges now that the stones are gone, but it has been flattened enough by its time under the weight that it stays mostly open, and you hold it between your two hands as you would hold an open book, the creamy surface sloping gently toward the center. You look at the scroll again, this time not to read but simply to see it as a whole, the pattern of the dark text and the pale margins, the red silk cord still coiled on the table where you left it, and you take a slow, deep breath that fills your chest and pushes your shoulders back, just a fraction, the kind of breath a singer might take before the first quiet note of a rehearsal. You do not walk to the center of the room, because this is not a performance. You simply turn slightly where you stand, facing the window so that the light falls over your shoulder onto the parchment, and you bring the scroll up to a comfortable reading height. Not so high that your arms will tire quickly, but high enough that your chin is not pressed against your chest. The position is natural and easy, the posture of a man who has spent many hours holding documents and bells and other things that must be presented to the world, and you feel your shoulders settle into their accustomed place, neither stiff nor slouched. The breeze from the window stirs the edge of the parchment with a tiny papery flutter, and you wait for it to pass before you begin, because the words will still be there when the breeze is gone. The proclamation begins with the threefold call of Ayes, the ancient Norman French word that commands the people to hear and be silent, and you part your lips barely, letting the first syllable form in the back of your throat as a mere breath of sound. "O Ayes," you murmur, the word barely louder than a whisper, a single, soft note that hangs in the air for a moment and then fades. You repeat it a second time, this time letting the vowel stretch a little longer, feeling the way the sound vibrates gently in your larynx. A low, buzzing sensation that is pleasant rather than straining. The third oyes follows after a measured pause, and you notice that the three repetitions, when spoken in this low, unhurried way, blend into a single rising and falling arc of sound, the first oyes setting the pitch, the second sustaining it, the third letting it settle back down like a leaf dropping onto still water. You close your mouth and listen to the silence that returns, the silence that is always waiting to receive the words, and you nod slightly to yourself, as if confirming something you already knew. You look down at the scroll and find the first sentence of the proclamation proper, the line that announces the authority under which the court will sit, and you begin to read the words in the same low murmur, your voice barely disturbing the air a foot beyond your face. His Majesty's Justices of Assize for the county, you say, and then you pause, because the phrase ends with a preposition that naturally hangs in the air, waiting for the rest of the sentence to follow. You try the full phrase again, letting the words roll off your tongue in a slow, unhurried procession. His Majesty's Justices of Assize for the county of Stafford do hereby give notice and command. The words are formal and heavy, each one carrying its own small weight of legal meaning, and you speak them without any attempt to make them sound grand or impressive, only clear and audible, the way a bell tolls without trying to make its note beautiful, but achieves beauty through its very plainness. You pause after the word command and look at the tiny tick you have placed in the margin just there, a reminder to take a breath before the next phrase, and you obey the mark you have made, drawing a slow, silent breath through your nose and releasing it before you continue. The pace you are setting is slow, slower than you would speak in the square, because this is not a rehearsal of volume or projection, but a rehearsal of rhythm and clarity, a feeling out of the words to learn where they want to be, hurried, and where they want to be, lingered over. You read the next sentence through to its end, a long winding sentence that lists the date and the place and the persons required to attend, and you notice that your voice wants to drop at certain points, the natural tendency of the speaking voice to fall at the end of a clause, so you make a small mental note to lift those endings slightly when you speak in the square. Not enough to sound questioning, but just enough to keep the attention of the listeners. You lower the scroll for a moment and look out the window at the square, which is still largely empty except for a woman in a grey shawl who is crossing from the well to the baker's shop with a bucket in each hand, her footsteps a slow, rhythmic tap on the cobbles. You watch her until she disappears under the overhanging eaves of the baker's house, and then you look back at the parchment, finding your place again with ease, because you have already read these words so many times in your silent review that they have begun to feel like old acquaintances. You lift the scroll again, and this time you try a different section, the part where the names of the towns and villages within the assize jurisdiction are listed in a long, rolling catalogue, and you speak each name slowly and clearly, feeling the different shapes they make in your mouth. Abbots Bromley, with its soft, round first syllable and its crisp, clipped ending. Utoxeter, with its three quick syllables that trip over each other like children running down a hill. Leak, a single, blunt sound that you almost go sting in or a go loop golf. In Juland which channel its henavenstem. The practice continues in this same slow, methodical way, your murmur filling the cottage with a low, continuous hum that is not loud enough to be heard outside, but gives the room a sense of quiet occupation, the feeling of a space where someone is patiently attending to a task. You stop frequently to repeat a phrase, not because you have made a mistake, but because you want to feel the words settle into your mouth, to find the exact placement of each consonant and vowel that will make the proclamation effortless when the moment comes. You try the phrase, good and lawful men of the county several times, shifting the emphasis slightly each time, once with the weight on good, once with it on lawful, once evenly across all four words, and you decide that the even emphasis is the best, because it treats each word as equally important and does not color the meaning with any unintended shading. The phrase, to give their attendance and make their presentments, catches your tongue for a moment. The two similar-sounding endings tangling together in a small knot of syllables, and you stop to work through it slowly, breaking the words apart into their separate letters and then stitching them back together the way you might work oil into a stiff leather strap. You speak attendance slowly, then presentments, then you put them together in the full phrase, and after 3 repetitions the knot has loosened, the words flow cleanly, and you move on to the next line without any sign of frustration, because frustration has no place in this quiet room. The bell catches your eye as you pause between sections, its polished surface reflecting a distorted image of your own face bent over the parchment, and the sight of it reminds you that the proclamation is not only words but also sound. The sound of the bell that will call the people to listen, and the sound of the bell that will call the people to listen, and the sound of your voice that will deliver the message. You lower the scroll once more and pick up the bell by its freshly oiled leather strap, holding it carefully so that the clapper does not swing, and you lift it to the same level as your face, looking at the gleaming brass and the dark iron within. You do not ring it now, because the practice is for the words only and the bell will be rung in its proper time, but you hold it for a moment as a kind of reminder of the partnership between the two things, the metal and the voice, each one working with the other to carry the proclamation from the crown to the ears of the town. You set the bell back down on its felt base and return to the scroll, finding a new section near the end where the Latin phrases are clustered thickly, the legal terms that must be spoken correctly because they are the precise words that the law requires. You read each Latin phrase in your low murmur, separating the syllables with the care that the dotted line in the margin has reminded you to use. Coram judice, videlicet, praedictus, words that feel different in the mouth than the English that surrounds them, more angular and foreign, their vowels longer and their consonants sharper. You practice these phrases several times each, not trying to pronounce them as a Roman would, but simply to make them clear and understandable to an English ear, the way a schoolmaster might teach a child to pronounce a hard word by sounding it out slowly and then putting it together. The practice now begins to take on a rhythm that is almost meditative, the same kind of rhythm that settled over the polishing of the bell, a steady, unhurried pulse of speaking and pausing and breathing that fills the room with a quiet, living presence. Your voice, still kept low, has grown a little warmer and more settled. As you have continued, the initial stiffness of the first few phrases having melted away into a smooth, easy flow that carries the formal words without any sense of strain, you find yourself almost tasting the words as you speak them, feeling the way the consonants click and the vowels hum, and you begin to understand, as you have understood many times before, that language spoken aloud is not the same thing as language read silently, that it has a body and a weight and a texture that can only be felt when it passes through the mouth and the air. You read the entire proclamation through from beginning to end without stopping, the first full run of the text in your murmured voice, and when you reach the final word, you lower the scroll and stand still for a long moment, letting the silence return to the room the way water returns to a pool after a stone has dropped through it. The proclamation has been spoken, if only in a whisper, and the words have been tested and shaped and made ready. Your throat feels slightly dry from the extended murmuring, and you walk slowly to the table, where the cup of cold sage tea still waits, forgotten since the early morning. You lift the cup to your lips and take a single, slow sip, the liquid now completely cold and faintly bitter, the sage having steeped too long in the cooling water, but it wets your throat and clears away the small roughness that the practice has left behind. You set the cup down and look out the window at the square, which is now busier than it was before, the stalls beginning to appear in their accustomed places, and the townsfolk walking to and fro with the slow, purposeful steps of people who are not in a hurry but have things to do. The morning has almost passed, and the afternoon will soon arrive, bringing with it the hour when you must put on your war cloak and take the polished bell and the proclamation scroll into the square to make the announcement. That hour is still a little while away, a space of quiet time that you can use to rest your voice and gather your thoughts, and you decide to spend it in the same calm stillness that has filled the whole morning. A stillness that is not empty, but full of the quiet satisfaction of work done well and preparation completed. You roll the scroll up again slowly, taking care to keep the edges aligned, and you tie the red silk cord around it in the same simple bow, the ends trailing down in their two small loops that look like the folded wings of a butterfly. The scroll goes back on the desk where it came from, ready to be picked up when the moment calls. The polished bell remains on the table, its glow undiminished, and the oiled leather strap hangs on the chair where it has been resting, now soft and supple and ready to be threaded back through the crown when you prepare to leave. You walk to the hearth and add a single small log to the embers, not because the room is cold, but because you want the fire to be alive when you return. And then you sit down on the stool by the table once more, your hands resting on your knees, your breathing slow and deep, waiting for the afternoon, with the same patience that has carried you through every slow and careful task of the day. The afternoon passed in the cottage with the same slow, undemanding stillness that had filled the morning, the hours slipping by without any marker except the gradual shift of the light across the whitewashed walls and the deepening quiet from the square outside, as the market stalls were taken down one by one, and the townsfolk made their way home with their purchases and their empty baskets. You remained on the wooden stool for a long while after the practice of the proclamation, your hands resting on your knees, your eyes half closed, not sleeping but simply resting in the way a cat rests beside a fire, attentive to nothing and content with everything. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a soft, powdery bed of ash, with a single, steady ember glowing at its heart, and the room had grown cooler as the sun passed beyond the rooftops, the golden warmth of midday giving way to the paler, bluer light of the advancing afternoon. You rose once to add a small split log to the embers, watching it catch and flare with quiet orange flames that licked around the dry wood, and then you returned to the stool and let the warmth settle over your legs and your folded hands. The polished bell stood on the table where you had left it, its deep amber glow now softened by the changing light, and the oiled leather strap hung from the crown where you had rethreaded it after the leather had rested and absorbed the neatsfoot oil. The strap now supple and dark and ready for your hand. The proclamation scroll lay rolled and tied with the red silk cord on the writing desk, and everything in the cottage was in its proper place, waiting for the last slow task of the day. As the light outside the window began to lose its whiteness and take on the first faint blush of the approaching dusk, you knew that the time had come to go to the square. The streets would be quiet now, the market finished, the shops shuttered, the townspeople indoors preparing their evening meals, and the square would be empty, the cobbles swept clean by the town scavenger's boy, the stone market cross standing alone in the centre like a silent sentinel. This was the hour when you always practiced the proclamation in the open air, the hour when the town was still enough to let the words carry without competition from voices and cartwheels and the barking of dogs, and the stillness would let you hear your own voice as the townsfolk would hear it, rolling across the square and off the timbered gables and the leaded windows, a sound that belonged to the town itself. You had done this many times before, the evening practice, and it was not a performance but a final preparation, a way of greeting the space where the real announcement would be made, the way a carpenter taps a nail once more to be sure it is fully seated. You stood up from the stool and stretched your arms slowly above your head, feeling the gentle pull in your shoulders and along the sides of your back, and then you walked to the hearth and banked the fire for the evening, raking the embers into a small, compact mound and covering them with a layer of cool ash so that they would smoulder slowly and keep the chill from the room while you were gone. The iron poker was warm in your hand, its tip glowing faintly as you drew it through the ash, and you replaced it in its stand beside the hearth with the same careful economy of motion that you had used all day. Next you went to the wooden peg beside the door and took down your woolen cloak, a heavy, dark brown garment that fell to your ankles and had a deep hood that could be drawn up against the rain and the cold. The cloak smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp wool and the clean, sharp air of the many evenings you had worn it, and you swung it around your shoulders, settling the weight of it across your back and fastening the simple bone toggle at the throat. The wool was thick and warm, its fibers still holding a trace of the sun from the last time you had aired it on the hedge, and you felt the immediate, comforting insulation of it as it wrapped around your body and shut out the cooling air. You went to the table and took up the polished bell by its leather strap, lifting it with the same two-handed care you had used all day, and the brass caught the last light from the window and threw a soft golden gleam against the wall, a brief moving patch of warmth that danced across the plaster and then vanished as you carried the bell toward the door. The clapper hung silently inside, snug on its oiled thong, and the bell swung gently from your hand with a solid, reassuring heft that you could feel all the way up to your shoulder. You held the bell in your left hand, the strap looped twice around your wrist for security, and with your right hand you picked up the rolled proclamation from the desk, slipping it carefully into the deep inner pocket of your cloak, where it would be protected from any dampness in the air. The red silk cord was a small bright note of color against the dark wool, and you tucked the scroll in fully, patting the pocket once to be sure it was secure. Then you crossed to the door, lifted the latch, and stepped out into the gathering dusk. The air outside was cool and still, cooler than it had been in the morning, and it carried the faint, clean scent of dampening cobbles and wood smoke and the distant, earthy smell of the fields that lay beyond the town walls. The street in front of your cottage was empty, the cobbles dark with the moisture that had risen as the day's warmth faded, and the sky above the rooftops was a deep, even blue that shaded toward indigo in the east and still held a thin, pale line of gold along the western horizon where the sun had sunk below the hills. A few early stars were already visible, small, faint points of light that seemed to tremble in the high, cold air, and a single bat flickered overhead in its silent, erratic flight, chasing the last insects of the day. You stood for a moment just outside your door, letting the evening settle around you, and then you began to walk toward the market square. Your footsteps a slow, measured tap on the cobbles, the bell swinging gently at your side, with a faint rhythmic tick of the clapper against the inner curve, a sound so soft that only you could hear it. The street was a familiar one, lined with timber-framed houses whose overhanging upper stories made a dark, tunnel-like space that echoed your footsteps back to you in a soft, hollow whisper. The windows you passed were mostly shuttered, but here and there a candle flickered behind a pane of leaded glass, throwing a small, warm square of light onto the cobbles, and in one house you could hear the faint, muffled murmur of voices and the clink of a pot being set on a hearth, the quiet, domestic sounds of a family settling in for the night. You walked past these houses without pausing, your pace unhurried and steady, the way a man walks who knows every stone and every doorway and every turn of the path, and the bell at your side swung in a slow, regular arc that matched the rhythm of your steps. The market square opened up before you at the end of the street, a broad open space that was now completely empty, the stalls gone, the cobbles swept, the stone market cross rising from the center like a grey finger pointing toward the darkening sky, and the timbered Guildhall standing at the far end with its tall windows dark and its heavy door closed and barred for the night. You walked to the exact center of the square and stopped beside the market cross, a tall, weathered stone pillar that had stood in that spot for longer than any living memory could reach, its surface worn smooth by the hands of generations of criers and merchants and townsfolk who had leaned against it while they talked or listened or waited. The base of the cross was a broad octagonal platform of 3 low steps, and you stepped up onto the first step, which raised you just enough to see over the empty square to the dark shuttered faces of the buildings that ringed it. The square was so quiet that you could hear the soft, distant murmur of the stream at the edge of town, a sound that was only audible when all other sounds had ceased, and the air was so still that the smoke from the chimneys around you rose straight up into the sky in thin, pale columns that faded into the deepening blue. You let the silence stretch, standing perfectly still with the bell in your hand and the scroll against your chest, and you felt the peace of the evening settle over you like a second cloak, a quiet, weightless presence that asked nothing of you and gave nothing back except its own calm emptiness. After a long moment, you lifted the bell by its leather strap, holding it out to your side so that the brass caught the last faint light from the western sky, and you gave it a single, careful shake. The motion was not a violent one, but a smooth, sweeping arc that brought the clapper against the inner curve with a firm, clean contact, and the note that rang out was not the soft, tentative chime you had tested in the cottage, but a full, round, golden tone that swelled outward from the bell and filled the square with its presence. The note floated across the cobbles and brushed against the timbered gables and the chimney pots and the dark windows. A sound so pure and clear that it seemed to hang in the air for a long time before it slowly began to fade, its edges softening and blending into the returning silence the way a ripple on a pond spreads and flattens and disappears into the still water. You waited until the last vibration had died away completely, your eyes on the dark windows of the Guildhall, and then you reached into your cloak and drew out the Proclamation scroll, untying the red silk cord with a single slow pull and letting the parchment unroll itself in your hands. You held the scroll up to catch the dim light from the sky, and you began to speak. Your voice was no longer the low, private murmur you had used in the cottage, but your full, measured crier's voice, a voice that was loud enough to reach every corner of the square and clear enough to be understood at the farthest doorways, a voice that had been shaped by years of practice into an instrument as reliable as the bell itself. You spoke the opening call, Oyez, 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 and the 3 words rolled out across the square in a slow, steady cadence, each one rising and falling on the same even pitch. The sound of them absorbed by the still air and the stone walls and the shuttered windows, returning to you only as the faintest echo that bounced back from the Guildhall facade and mingled with the silence. You let the echo die, and then you began the body of the proclamation, reading the words that you had marked and practiced and shaped all through the morning and the afternoon, and they came out of your mouth as easily as water flows from a spring. The proclamation filled the square with its long, formal sentences, the names of the justices, the date and the hour, the list of towns and villages, the Latin phrases that you pronounced slowly and clearly, and your voice carried across the empty space without any strain, a steady, rolling stream of sound that seemed to belong to the evening itself, as natural as the call of a blackbird or the rustle of the wind in the thatch. You did not hurry. You took each breath at the marked ticks, each pause a small, deliberate space that let the words settle in the mind of any imaginary listener, and you let the final phrase, God save the King, hang in the air for a long moment before you lowered the scroll. The sound of your voice faded gradually, absorbed by the cobbles and the walls and the darkening sky, and the silence that followed was deep and complete, a silence that seemed to have been listening all along and was now returning to its original state, richer for having held the words for a little while. You stood on the steps of the market cross for a long time after you had finished, the scroll still open in your hand, the bell still warm from its single ring, and you listened to the quiet that had returned to the square. The town around you was sleeping, or nearly so, and the only sound was the distant, soft murmur of the stream and the occasional far-off bark of a dog in the countryside beyond the walls. The sky had darkened fully now. The last gold faded from the horizon and the stars, grown bright and numerous, scattered across the deep blue-black vault like grains of salt spilled on a dark table. The air was cold on your face and you felt the pleasant, tired warmth of your own body inside the thick woolen cloak, a warmth that contrasted with the coolness on your cheeks and the tips of your ears. You did not feel any particular emotion, only a quiet, steady satisfaction that was almost indistinguishable from the stillness around you. A sense that the day had been lived as it should have been lived, slowly and carefully and without waste. At last you rolled the proclamation scroll back up, aligning the edges with the same care you had used in the cottage, and you tied the red silk cord around it, the bow coming together under your fingers as naturally as a habit. You slipped the scroll back into the inner pocket of your cloak, and you stepped down from the market cross, the leather soles of your boots making a soft, solid sound on the cobbles. The bell hung from your hand once more, its polished surface invisible in the darkness, but its weight familiar and reassuring, and you began the slow walk back through the empty streets to your cottage. The sound of your footsteps, the only noise in the sleeping town. The cottage was warm when you opened the door, the banked fire having kept the chill at bay, and the room was filled with the faint, orange glow of the embers you had covered with ash, a light so dim it barely reached the walls. You set the bell down on the table and unlatched your cloak, hanging it back on its peg by the door, and then you lit a single tallow candle from the embers with a spill of twisted paper, the small flame springing up and throwing a soft, yellow light across the table. You took the felt-lined box from its place on the chest and placed it beside the bell, and you lifted the bell carefully, holding it for a moment with the candlelight gleaming on its polished curbs before you laid it gently into its shaped hollow in the grey felt. The leather strap you coiled beside it, and the clapper thong you checked once more with a light touch, finding it still supple and sound. Then you closed the lid of the box, pressing it down until the brass clasp clicked into place, and you carried the box to the chest at the foot of your bed, where it would rest until the morning of the court opening. The proclamation scroll you placed on the writing desk, ready to be returned to the Guildhall, and the candle you left burning for a few more minutes while you prepared for sleep, its small flame a quiet companion in the dark room. The day was over, the polishing done, the words spoken, and the town was silent around you as you lay down on the straw mattress and pulled the wall blanket up to your chin, your eyes closing on the darkness and your mind drifting into the same calm, steady stillness that had carried you through every slow and careful hour since the first grey light of dawn.